Hello. Hey, everybody. Fantastic to see everyone here. We'll just ask, do we have anyone else that needs to come into the room, Cecilia, or are we? We're good. We are just on 1 o'clock. Okay. Thank you, everyone, for coming today. I'm just going to bring up my list of very large items to run through quickly before we start. Okay, so welcome and thank you for joining us for this event, System Boundaries for a Just World on a Safe Planet. I'm Maya Rebermark, Future Earth, and I'll be helping lead you through the proceedings today with my colleague, Fredrik Moberg. Can wink there. Oh, many of you know him already. But before we open, I want to draw you to this big slide. So we are about to go through a lot of science today that is currently still not published. The embargo will be today at 5 o'clock at the end of the event. So we ask if everyone could please not share photos. You're free to, take notes, take pictures, but please don't share until the close of the event today. So it's a very important part of the terms with the journal. Thank you. It's a really rich program, so we're going to try to keep to time. And first of all, I want to welcome to the stage Professor Lars Bergström, who is the first Vice President of the Swedish Royal Academy of Sciences. Please, Lars, take the floor. Thank you.
Thank you. Dear participants, on behalf of the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences, and as Vice President of this Academy, I wish you all welcome to this timely and exciting symposium in our beautiful Beijer Hall. The Academy has a long history, since 1739, when Carolus Linnaeus was one of the founders of the Academy. And the prime objective still today is to support and foster good evidence-based science and bring it to the general public. One important way to do this, and what the Academy is probably most well known for internationally, is to award Nobel Prizes in physics and chemistry, which it has done since 1901. An important person in the early years of the Nobel work was actually Svante Arrhenius, who himself received the chemistry prize in 1903, but who nowadays is most famous for already in 1896, more than 100 years ago. He calculated by hand the global warming effect of carbon dioxide in a heroic effort. It took him almost a year and did everything by hand, hundreds of thousands of calculations. And the results still stand, amazingly. So this was a real heroic effort. And of course, this was much improved then over the years, and by, among others, Manabe and Hasselmann, who received the 2021 Nobel Prize in Physics. The Academy also has a long history of hosting the secretariats in the field of global change research. The late Swedish meteorologist Bert Bolin was chairing the first IPCC between 1988 and 1997. He also helped establish the International Geosphere Biosphere Program, IGBP, at the Academy in the mid-1980s. And IGBP was hosted at the Academy for some 25 years, when the International Science Council established Future Earth. And one of the global offices of Future Earth, as you may know, is here in Stockholm and has been here since 2013. Again showing the strong support of the Academy for global change research. And I now give the word to the Global Hub Director of Future Earth Sweden, Wendy Broadgate, for some introductory remarks about Future Earth and also something about the Earth Commission. Thank you.
Thank you, Lars. It's so great to welcome everybody here to the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences. It's great to see such a full room of people from all over the world, both scientists and different stakeholders, to present the work of the Earth Commission. So what is the Earth Commission? It was an assessment set up in 2019 with a goal to quantify the safe and just Earth system boundaries for people and the planet. It's the first major instance of this work will be published later today at 5 o'clock. The Earth Commission work also reviews methodologies for translation of these boundaries to downscale them, and also reviews levers and barriers for systems transformation. So the synthesis, or the Earth Commission, is hosted by Future Earth, the world's biggest network of global sustainability scientists, coordinated from its offices here in the Academy. More than 60 scientists have been involved in the Earth Commission as co-authors and contributors to its working groups and the scientific secretariat, and many of those people are here today, so we're delighted to share this work with you. As scientists, we have a responsibility to share our knowledge with society. So the Earth Commission, it provides the scientific foundation stone of the Global Commons Alliance, which is supporting businesses, cities and citizens and countries to accelerate systems change and become better guardians of the global commons. And we'll be hearing from friends in the Alliance today as well. I was going to show that slide of all the people in the Earth Commission. But now finally, a somber moment. I'd like to pay tribute to former colleague and friend and mentor, Will Steffen, who passed away earlier this year. He was director of IGBP, working in this building from 1998 to 2004, convening workshops and syntheses like the Earth Commission. He made huge contributions, and he was one of the leaders that made big contributions to developing the concept of the Anthropocene, that humans are the biggest driver of change on the planet, developed through things like the Great Accelerations and the first synthesis of IGBP. He was also one of the fathers of planetary boundaries and hothouse Earth. And we at the Earth Commission would like to dedicate our work to him and this symposium to him. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. We now have also a video address from one of the co-chairs of the Earth Commission, Professor Jin Dahe, who is also one of the directors at the Chinese Academy of Sciences. Now, this should play.
Distinguished guests and friends, dear colleagues, good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I would like to express a warmest welcome to all of you to participate in this symposium of the Earth Commission at the Royal Sweden Academy of Sciences. The Earth Commission is an international team of the high-level scientists convened by Earth Future Earth. The objective of the Earth Commission is integrating different natural systems and social systems to define safe and just targets, investigates how the global biophysical boundaries need to be adjusted to ensure a safe and just future for people and the planet. Human well-being and planetary health and interdependent safe and just planetary targets need to be defined to safeguard the ability of Earth's biophysical systems to continue to function and provide the services to all of living beings on Earth. Such targets need to avoid significant harm to humans, communities, countries, and can also prevent us from crossing tipping points for the planet. The choices we make today will determine the future of us and our future generations. In the face of the challenge, no one in the world should stay out of it. The first major scientific report of the Earth Commission will be published at the end of this today. I'm looking forward to interacting with scientific colleagues on the commission first set the results. It's a pity that I cannot attend today's symposium, and I hope all of you, my friends and colleagues, will enjoy in today's activities and have a great harvest. Thank you very much.
And so now on to our next presentation. If I would just like to ask Johanna Joita to join us on the stage. I am going to ask forgiveness from the audience today. To keep to time, I'm not going to be able to go through everybody's affiliations, but we have listed everyone on the slide so that you can see the extent of the broad scientific experience here. So I will hand over right now. Thank you both.
Yeah, I can stand like this. Okay. So thanks, Maya, and wonderful to be here. This is just like Wendy said, quite a breakthrough moment. This is 3 years of work with colleagues from the social sciences and natural sciences across the world to really put forward a state-of-the-art scientific assessment of safe and just boundaries for humanity's future on Earth. And I think it is really worth to place this in the context also of where we're standing today at the Swedish Royal Academy of Sciences, where, just as Wendy pointed out, much of the evidence requiring a safe and just space for humanity on Earth, which emanates from the evidence that we are today putting the stability and the resilience of the entire Earth system at risks, largely originates from decades of research here through the International Geosphere Biosphere Program and the Future Earth science community, showing that we're deep into the Anthropocene with all the hockey stick pressures. Will Steffen was one of the leading scientists putting forward this research. The stability of the Holocene, which is today verified that the last 12,000 years is a unique reference point for us in order to guide our futures as modern civilizations on Earth, and the fact that we're approaching tipping points. Putting all this together is the evidence that placed ourselves in a point to propose of establishing an Earth Commission, the first holistic people-planet science assessment in the world. The unique breakthrough here is that for the first time, we're measuring for each of the Earth system boundaries, not only safety, but also justice within the same unit. And therefore, the justice developments have been, if anything, the real big development forward. Joita.
So basically, we are arguing that people and planet are interdependent and that our behavior is undermining the critical life support systems of the planet, which in turn then harms humans. And it causes major injustices like deaths and disease. And therefore, we need an assessment of the safe and just boundaries that takes into account Earth system resilience as well as human well-being and preventing significant harm to humans.
So let's start with the safe assessment. The aims of what will be published, what you'll have available later today in the Nature research article, is therefore summarizing both the assessment on the safe Earth system boundaries and the just Earth system boundaries in terms of significant harm. And we are integrating these, and the safe and just Earth system boundaries define the safe space. And we're using the one of these two that provides the most stringent lower level as the definition of the integrated boundary level. So that's what gives us the space. But let's start with the safe part. I'd like to just emphasize also that the planetary boundary science has identified 9 large biophysical systems and processes that regulates, scientific evidence shows, regulates the stability and resilience of the planet. The Earth Commission took 5 of these 9 as focus areas to define the safe and just boundaries. The choice of these was to have an integration between biosphere and climate. The choice of theirs was to pick those that are closest to humans and human well-being on the ground, and also to have the ability of concretizing quantitative, safe and just boundaries for the operational scale. So to move from global to local levels. The 5 you see here, it's climate, it's aerosols, air pollution, basically air pollution, nutrient cycles, so both nitrogen and phosphorus, freshwater cycle, and biosphere integrity. And in the biosphere integrity, we integrate both biodiversity and land. So these are the 5 domain areas where we've developed 8 indicators for these 5. If we start with the safe boundaries, the work on climate lands in confirming both the IPCC and the Planetary Boundary Science that 1.5 degrees Celsius is the safe boundary level beyond which we're likely to cross a number of tipping points, and we'll come back to the tipping point analysis later in the seminar today. On nature, it's a major step forward of being able to identify and quantify safe targets both for intact nature, the remaining roughly 40 to 50% of nature which is still intact, but also quantifying the minimum level of ecosystem functions in managed nature, like agricultural lands. So both of these are included, and both of these are quantified. For freshwater, we have set safe and just boundaries both for surface water and for groundwater. Again, very operational at watershed and community level. Then nitrogen and phosphorus, quantifying these, largely verified by the earlier research on critical loads and planetary boundary science, quantifying these for safety and giving a full integration. For aerosol pollutants, this has been a major challenge to get that both in terms of the scientific evidence of how air pollution, the dimming of the lower atmosphere, impacts on rainfall patterns at the larger regional scale, but also how it impacts at local level, and giving quantifications for both. So we've been able to come very far on giving these quantifications for all these 5 areas with 8 indicators, and you'll find them very well spelled out in the Nature paper that will be presented later today. And then we have the just boundaries.
And the question is, are safe boundaries also just? And we argue that just boundaries also minimize significant harm to humans. And so basically what we have done is we've tried to create a theorization of justice. And our justice begins with the idea that we will focus on ideal rather than conservative justice. We take into account a recognition justice, which is looking at other people's perspectives on justice, and epistemic justice, which is looking at other people's knowledge on various issues. And we look at interspecies and justice and earth system stability, intergenerational justice, and intragenerational justice. In terms of process and procedural justice, we look at access to information, decision-making, civic space, and courts. So this paper is sort of trying to meet the access to information part of justice for all of you. In terms of substantive justice, we look at access to basic minimum resources, as well as the allocation of the remaining resources, responsibilities between countries and peoples and cities, and the division of harm between various regions of the world. Now, those are the elements of justice, and we apply this through a process of goals and means. In terms of goals, we are looking at the boundaries, which we are just going to discuss, the two of us now. We are also looking at what does it mean to have just minimum access for the world, and Professor Diana Liverman will discuss that subsequently. And we look at means, and in terms of means, we are looking at transformation of the global system to live within these boundaries, as well as translation down to actors such as business and cities. In terms of trying to explain to you how we did this, well, a safe boundary at 1.5 degrees centigrade allows already for significant harm to more than 200 million people. And we argue that to avoid exposure of more than 10 million people being harmed by climate change, a much more stringent target of 1 degree centigrade is needed. So that is why our just boundary for climate is 1 degree, and therefore our safe and just boundary is 1 degree centigrade. If you look at nutrients, then for phosphorus, our safe and just boundaries coincide. But for nitrogen, we have a more stringent boundary. Going further to aerosols, at the global level, the safe and just boundary coincide. But at the local level, we feel that we need to have a stringent aerosol boundary. If you look at all the areas that we have, then basically what we see is that we have safe and just boundaries coinciding for intact nature, managed nature, surface runoff, groundwater, as well as for phosphorus. But that in fact, justice ends up making nitrogen, aerosol pollutants, and climate much more stringent. Also, we combine these global boundaries with local standards. The question is, have they been breached?
So that is the big proof in the end. But just before coming to breach, as an Earth system scientist and the colleagues on the Earth Commission, we find it very reassuring that when integrating this with the social sciences, many of the boundaries come out with the same level for justice and safety, which shows that environmental stability is fundamental also for human equity and justice. But we have a number of boundaries where actually you hit the just levels earlier than the safety level. Basically that you knock over large numbers of people before you risk permanent, irreversible changes for your system. So this is, in a way, showing why we need a fully integrated people-planet approach to be able to guide our future in the Anthropocene. The question is, where are we then? Well, our assessment is shown here for the full safe and just boundary assessment. So you see the full space, and actually the safe and just boundary levels for climate and nitrogen are the blue lines that are the ones that are relevant here. 7 of the 8 indicators that we have quantified are outside of the safe and just space. The only one that is inside for the global level is aerosol loading, so air pollutants. But again, as Joita says, if you take that down to the local level, you find regions where even the aerosol pollutant level is outside of a safe and just level. So this is confirming much of the research in the IPCC, IPBES, and the planetary boundary science, that we are truly continuing a journey of high risk in the Anthropocene, undermining biosphere resilience, and at the same time being in the midst of a climate crisis. Now, we've been able, which is thanks to the fact that we have scalable boundaries, to bring this down to an integrated assessment at the pixel level of how the breaching of these safe and just boundaries distribute themselves spatially. Now, what you see here is the darker the red, the larger the number of safe and just Earth system boundaries that are transgressed, that are breached. But it's not an assessment of who is causing this breaching. It's an assessment of the impact of the breaching, affected of the breaching. And what you see, which is not surprising, is that large parts of the developing world are to a large extent victims of the breaching of these safe and just boundaries compared to large parts of the more wealthy North. The question then is, how can we live within these safe and just Earth system boundaries, the transformation points to achieve this?
So this particular story is only part of the work of the Earth Commission. And basically what I'm trying to show you in this slide goes beyond some of the work that we did in this particular paper. The red storyline that you see there is the safe boundary. The blue is the just boundary, where the just boundary is more stringent than the safe boundary. At the bottom, you'll see a blue dotted line, which is minimum access. So what happens if you provide everybody in the world with minimum access to water, food, energy, infrastructure, and housing? And then you look at what are the remaining resources, and that's shown in the green area in the safe and just corridor. And basically what we are arguing is that if we want to live within these safe and just boundaries, we need to meet the minimum access needs of all people, but we also need to have large-scale redistribution, which complements the role of technologies in also enhancing efficiency of resource use. And all this has to be part of our transformative process and also be translated down to actors such as cities and businesses. We advance our research advances over existing research, and perhaps you would like to take this on.
Yeah, no, I just want to kind of come back where we started as a concluding remark, that uniqueness here, what Joita just showed in the previous slide, is that we're quantifying and measuring access justice, harm justice, and safety along the same units in order to have a measurable pathway for our transformation towards a safe and just future. So that is the unique here. That's how it complements planetary boundaries or donut economics and other type of frameworks. We're also really focusing in on science for scalability, to have it operational with the Science-Based Target Network, for example, represented here today, and the ability to translate this into work that can be scaled. The next phase for this will, to a large extent, focus on continuing the translation and the transformation pathways into the future. So we think that this is a really important step forward in the global sustainable development policy and development agenda in the world.
To sum up, a safe and just framework means that we have quantified safe and just Earth system boundaries. We say that some just boundaries are much more stringent than the safe boundaries. 7 of the 8 globally defined safe and just boundaries have been breached at global level, and many locally defined safe and just boundaries have been breached in many parts of the world. ESBs must also be justly achieved through just access for all, as well as just transformation supported by translation to businesses and cities. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Judita and Johan. We now have the pleasure of going a little bit further into the details of all of the system boundaries. Please welcome to the floor a very wonderful colleague, David Armstrong Mackay, who is here from the UK today with us. David, please take over. There you are.
Cool, thanks very much. And thanks, Johan and Judita, for the introduction. So I'm going to be talking quickly about the safe and just climate Earth system boundaries. So as we've already seen, 1.5 degrees is our safe Earth system boundary. And that's a number that is supported by various different strands of evidence, including climate tipping points, but also reflects some of the IPCC research as well. But the just boundary is lower. It's at 1 degrees, as they were presenting earlier. So what's the basis of these? So for the safe climate boundary, one of the main things we were looking at is recent assessment we did of climate tipping points. This is shown in this map here, showing 16 of the different climate tipping elements we identified in that recent paper in Science published in September that the Earth Commission funded. And you can see the different coloured dots reflect at what global warming levels some of these tipping points might occur. So in red in particular, you have ones that could occur below 2 degrees. You have things like the Greenland ice sheet collapse, you have the boreal permafrost abrupt thaw, we have the West Antarctic ice sheet collapse, we have low latitude coral reef die-off as well, and Barents Sea ice as well. All of these are possible below 2 degrees of warming. And in fact, 5 of these climate tipping points are already possible now at current global warming of about 1.2 degrees. And 4 of those become likely beyond 1.5 degrees of warming. So that's a really key part of our Earth system boundary being set at 1.5. But we also have past climate variability is also informing this as well. So we know that beyond 1 degrees, we're going beyond the Holocene. 1.5 degrees is going beyond even the warm interglacials of the past couple of million years. We also have biosphere functioning as well, in particular thinking about carbon sinks. Beyond 1.5 degrees, some key carbon sinks are transitioning from being sources, from being sinks to sources, and that helps to make climate change worse. And together, all of these things are really moving towards a point where there's systemic disruption of the climate system, not just some climate impacts, but really sort of systemic issues. We also include the long-term committed changes of some of these things. So ice sheets and biomes in particular, they're very long-term changes that play out over hundreds to thousands of years. And those are as important to consider as some of the really near-term impacts as well. And finally, in terms of geographical scale, tipping points have mostly regional impacts. Some of them are more global, but the ESB we set is global in nature. Moving on to the just side of things, this is to do with the number of people exposed to significant harm. So you've already seen this figure before, but just to go through it in a little more detail, we have in purple, we have the extreme heat. This is the number of people exposed to mean annual temperature greater than 29 degrees. And you can see that soon after you reach 1 degree, it starts shooting up. And by the time you get to the 2.7 degrees that we're heading towards under current policies, over 1 billion people are being exposed to extreme heat levels. In the orange, we have the wet bulb temperature. So this is a combination of heat and humidity, and that has really severe impacts on human health. And the orange line shows the number of people exposed to a wet bulb temperature of over 35 degrees. You can see that that orange line is gradually increasing from around about 0 degrees warming, and gradually beyond 1 degree, you're starting to see more and more people exposed to this wet bulb extremes. The blue line shows sea level rise. The solid line is a sea level rise you'd see by 2100, but because ice sheet melt is such a long-term commitment, the dotted line shows the long-term multi-centennial, after hundreds of thousands of years, how many people are being exposed to sea level rise. And you can see how much it shoots up beyond current warming of 1.2 degrees. By the time you get to 2, hundreds of millions of people are definitely being committed to being exposed to significant harm from sea level rise. And that's the basis of both our safe and just climate Earth system boundaries. Peter.
Thank you very much. I will continue with the biosphere. And for the biosphere, we have 2 different boundaries. And we need 2 boundaries to capture the multiple facets of nature, of the biosphere, of biodiversity. Because the biosphere is about ecosystems. It's also about species, genetic diversity, but also about the services that the biosphere provides to the Earth system stability and to people directly. So, while in general, normally, when we talk about biodiversity, we often look at protected areas. We look at big wilderness. But as we found in here, we also need to look beyond these real natural areas to the nature that is in the landscapes that we live in, the landscapes that provide our food. Because we're dependent in the functioning of the Earth system on the trees that are in agricultural land, because there's more trees in agricultural land than in the Amazon, all sequestering carbon, but also providing habitats to pollinators, pest control, and other important functions, and also providing shade in cities, lowering urban heat island effects, benefiting people in their health. So we need to look at these multiple facets. So that's why we have 2 boundaries. The first one focuses on these larger natural areas where the natural processes are largely intact. That doesn't mean excluding humans completely, but it means managing those areas in ways that the natural functions are largely remaining function. There's quite a lot of scientific evidence that the current areas of nature that we are left are not sufficient to avoid irreversible loss of species, or are also not sufficient to support important Earth system functions. Think about that the Amazon, where we're at the area of reaching a tipping point of deforestation. So the biosphere very much interacting with the climatic system there. Protecting natural ecosystem area is also more than just protecting protected areas. 30% targets of protected areas are a means to protect remaining natural areas and restore some of them, but they are insufficient to have the whole system. So we need more than that. Then moving to what we call the functional integrity boundary. And we especially apply that boundary in areas where we have managed landscapes, cities, agricultural landscapes, forestry landscapes. And what we found that in those landscapes, we need a certain amount of nature, semi-natural elements, small patches of forest, small patches of wetlands that are needed to make these landscapes functional. How did we determine that number? We made an analysis of the important ecosystem services in those areas. And here you see in this graph what we found. although there is a lot of variation, what you will see for important functions like pollination, pest and disease control, health and cultural benefits, soil erosion, water quality, we see if we have less than 10% of semi-natural habitat in our managed landscapes, we don't find those functions to be sufficient to supporting the functioning of those landscapes anymore. And people will face a shortage of the functioning in those landscapes. We also see that for some functions like soil erosion control in very steep sloping lands, we might need more nature. So it's a context-dependent boundary, but at the same time we see a general pattern that across all those services we need at least 20 to 25% of the landscape being dedicated to green spaces to have those landscapes functioning for people. And there's another important aspect to that. We need this everywhere. Why do we need it everywhere? It's because a lot of those functions are dependent on mobile species. And if you think about like pollination done by bees and bumblebees and other pollinators, they don't fly from South Africa to Europe to pollinate our crops. We need them within the natural habitat for those species, within distance of where we need those services. So this is also where the just and safe come together. We need those habitats for our Earth system functioning. They regulate water. They ensure infiltration of water towards the groundwater systems and replenish those. But we also need people to be able to access those services, to benefit from regulation of water flow, avoiding flood risks, and avoiding from pollination of their crops, and avoiding that we need to use unhealthy pesticides to control diseases in our agricultural lands. So this is a global boundary which is needed at all places around the world. And are we there? We made a rough assessment based on high-resolution data to estimate how much of semi-natural habitat do we find within each square kilometer of the world. And what you see here is in the yellowish and light green colors, we see that important landscapes do not have enough semi-natural habitat to ensure its functioning. In those landscapes, we are dependent on external inputs that might be harmful for people, that might take a lot of fossil fuels to produce, and that are not always resilient solutions in areas of change and not providing justice to people. And we see that these yellowish areas, they are spread both in places with very vulnerable people, but also in places in landscapes where there's wealthy people that might also have strong benefits and better lives of engaging more with nature and having more nature to serve their grounds. Thank you very much. And we'll now move to Christopher Corden, and he will bring us to the next boundaries on water.
This one. Okay, well, good afternoon to all of you. I would like to mention that I have a co-chair in the name of Prof. Stuart Bunn of Griffiths University, Australia, who unfortunately could not be here with us. And I'd also like to acknowledge Ben Stuart Costa, who did a lot of the work behind this. I was told not to look at this screen, but this screen is not working. So just to reiterate what has been said before in terms of what our boundaries are and what is safe and what is just, you find in the case of water, the safe and just boundaries are the same. Now, water is kind of special because water is a great diluter, but is also a great transporter. So when you're talking about global matters, you have to realize that water moves some of the nutrients, the pollutants. It moves also the issues of climate. I'll have to go on with this. Yeah. So I'm sorry, I can't read this. I will have to move. No, not a problem. I'm used to this. Yeah. So we are looking to protect freshwater systems. And those of you who are familiar with the SDG 6, you realize the targets of freshwater available for all. This is very aspirational, because as has been mentioned already, there are differences depending on where you are in the globe. But water provides fisheries, we have potable water that we need to drink and we take for granted in many parts of the world. And then you have all the issues related to biodiversity. Freshwater ecosystems actually, maybe David will disagree with me, but they are the most impacted in terms of problems with biodiversity loss. It's also been pointed out to me that in our analysis of blue water, we did not, thank you very much, we did not mention or did not include wetlands, and that I'm sure will be included in the next Earth Commission too. So the question is, can we live in a safe and just planet when it comes to water? And what we did was to analyze globally how much of water has been affected in terms of disruption, that is, the anthropogenic interruption of flow. And we said that where you have natural flow altered by at least 20%, then that boundary has been breached. The safe and just boundary for surface water requires that all the water in a particular catchment should not be altered by 20%. As we said at the beginning, the safe and just boundaries are the same. But we know that this has been breached. And this is a map from the Asia-Pacific region, and what you see in the darkest places are where you have significant changes in monthly rainfall above the norm. Now, given that these areas are among the most highly populated areas of the globe, you can imagine the number of people who are impacted. We are estimating between 1.2 and 1.6 billion people are living beyond the safe boundary. Now, can we live in a safe and just planet when it comes to water? When it comes to groundwater, the safe boundary is when we are looking at areas where the amount of extraction of water is higher than its replenishment. Places like Florence in Italy have had a drop in groundwater of over 25 meters over the past 100 years due to extraction of groundwater. And that is, of course, compounded by the fact that you often start getting into saline water, which means the water that you do take up as groundwater is no longer fit for purpose. The safe and just boundary is the same as the safe, as I said, and this has been also significantly breached. The map there where we are not supposed to tweet or message is coming from a paper by Ben Stewart Costa in Press right now, where all those areas in red are areas where we feel that this has been breached. Now, what can we do about it? Because it's very well and good to complain. And one of the problems we have working with decision makers is the gloom and doom of the climate and scientists. We're always complaining that we are all going to die. But we can fix it. Maybe not in my lifetime, but certainly beyond. So we have to look at it in two ways. The supply side, i.e. how much water is going out, and the demand side, how much water we are taking. And we suggest 7 approaches. One is interbasin transfer, which for me as a limnologist is the worst case scenario, because with interbasin transfer you also transfer unwanted biodiversity. We need to shift between groundwater and surface water. Best way is to transition to a green water agriculture or climate smart agriculture. And the last on the supply side is to improve water quality and treatment. I'm being told that if you take water from the tap in the Rhine and you look at the transition from Switzerland down to France, water has gone through the human body at least 9 times, from drinking water to excretion and treated and down. That's why I live in Ghana. The demand side transformation is we need to increase the efficiency of water use. A lot of the problems we have in cities is the loss of water through outmoded pipes, outmoded plumbing systems is over 50%. And that is all the waste of not just the water, but the energy used to treat the water, the chemicals used to treat the water, and of course the time. And of course to increase the productivity of water from all sources. And with that, I would like to hand over to Chris. Chris with a K.
That was great. And thank you. I'm going to be talking about the nutrient boundaries. And it's appropriate that it comes right after water, that the nutrients are deeply bound with all the comments that you heard about water. Their system boundaries are not independent. They work together. I want to make just one comment on this slide. When you look at nitrogen, that green line should be a blue line for just boundary. You saw that before, but couldn't get this fixed. We think about nutrients, we're thinking about nitrogen and phosphorus. One of the key sources of those in the environment comes from fertilizers. And so the focus in setting the safe boundary was agricultural surplus, looking at beyond what is used and removed by crops. So a very important focus, and there's ways, obviously, this could be extended to think about other ways and looking at the other sources of nitrogen and phosphorus in the environment. It's important to look at the surplus because it drives environmental degradation. We know that excess nutrients from fertilizers drive pollution in soils, fresh water that you just heard about in the ocean. So much of the pollution that is damaging our fresh water comes from nitrogen and phosphorus in the environment and from fertilizers. Because these are intimately connected with certain practices and locations, the boundaries were set at local to global scales. Specifically for phosphorus, when looking at the safe limit, we're looking at eutrophication, basically the death of waterways. There's a note here about how the scientific literature was used to calculate the losses, surpluses, and inputs. Harm comes from the eutrophication that affects our ecosystems, their services, and ultimately affects biodiversity loss and affects freshwater quality, as you just heard from Chris. And then looking at safe, we're looking at the human health consequences of impacts on losses of freshwater quality. As you saw on the previous slide, 2 slides ago, that the safe and just boundaries are the same for phosphorus, and they are outside the limits. Nitrogen is also a contributor to eutrophication. We have a sign here of algal blooms, which are a problem around the world. Again, the scientific literature was used to model the surplus and the subglobal loss. Eutrophication, again, leads to damage to ecosystems, the toxic algal blooms I just showed. And as you saw in the slide for the boundaries, that the nitrogen Earth system boundary is just outside the safe and just, and that the just is more constraining than the safe. And finally, transformations are needed to make sure that we reduce excess fertilizer use. We also have to look at unrecycled sewage because it's a major source of phosphorus. Ways that we do obtain access to phosphorus include mining, that's often quite damaging. Manufacturing nitrogen-based fertilizers requires quite a lot of energy, therefore increases greenhouse gas emissions, which affects the climate target you heard about from David. And there's ways to replace that by thinking about, for example, green ammonia, something that has been promoted quite heavily, certainly in parts of Europe. And as you heard from Joyita early on, innovation and redistribution are needed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. Marla, please take the floor. You can use this there. Thanks.
Okay, this is the forward. Okay. Yeah, thanks for, thanks to Maya, Lisa for organizing this. And upfront, I must also thank Caroline, Tejna, and Joyita for working behind the scene on this, particularly the just component of this aerosol loading. Okay, so aerosol, Johan already indicated that it's really a complex stuff. The problem is, unlike well-mixed greenhouse gases like CO2 or methane, which cause the climate problem, aerosol is highly localized, and not only that, it has both reflective aerosols and absorbing aerosols. So, which makes at least even the safe component, the quantification of the safe boundary, a bit harder because of its the basically heterogeneity. So what we have in this is basically for the safe boundary, at least the regional as well as global boundaries were defined. And in the case of just boundary, it was mainly focused on the health implications of aerosols. And so finally, I have put here this, what is the safe and just system boundaries. Since the just boundary is stricter than safe boundaries, we have basically chosen this less than 15 microgram per meter cube PM 2.5. So I'll just come to this, what these are, AOD as well as PM 2.5 in the next 1 or 2 slides. So basically, I think I just I have to actually go back and look at this aerosol problem in the context of planetary boundary problem. So in 2009, the paper led by Johan, basically the aerosol planetary boundary was identified, but no number was given, unlike in the case of climate change for global mean surface temperature or CO2. No boundary was quantified for aerosol, but luckily, in the next planetary PB2, the regional boundary of AOD 0.25 to 0.5 was identified. How does aerosol basically impact the climate system? Basically, what happens is if you have a lot of aerosol loading, it affects the sunlight that reaches the surface, which basically inhibits evapotranspiration, and basically it affects the hydrological cycle. So basically in South Asia, and also in the tropical monsoon region, this could be a serious problem because, billions of people, actually depend on, precipitation in the monsoon region. But even in that second paper, the global boundary was not defined. So I would consider, the novelty in this particular assessment is basically we could actually come out with a global aerosol boundary, which is basically based on the difference in the aerosol loading between the northern hemisphere and southern hemisphere. In fact, some of these ideas had a genesis from the recent IPCC report, which basically said some of the northern hemisphere monsoon regions, they had reduced monsoon precipitation from 1950s to 80s because of the northern hemisphere. There was plenty of aerosol emissions in the the last 50 years or so. Based on then of course in the last 10 or 15 years, there has been a lot of literature that looks at this interhemispheric difference in aerosol loading, and so that provided some clue about how to define the global boundary in this case. And another novelty in this particular in this Earth Commission work is that also health implications of aerosol was actually addressed. Okay, so as I indicated, so in the case of, let's look at what is safe. So safe basically, how does it affect the physical climate system? So in the case of, as I said, in the regional case, basically, aerosol can affect the water cycle. In the case of global, it can basically shift the, monsoon precipitation either towards the northern hemisphere or towards the southern hemisphere. So the metric that is used is basically AOD. AOD is basically aerosol optical depth. So it's basically a metric for the amount of aerosol, right? I think so. In the case of regional case, the aerosol aerosol optical depth, it should not exceed 0.25. So this basically, comes from the previous planetary boundary assessment. And in the case of global, basically we relied on this, shift between the two hemispheres. The monsoon could actually shift between the two hemispheres. So based on that, the boundary is fixed at basically 0.15. The current state, the interhemispheric AOD difference is 0.05. So that's one reason why, in the case of aerosol ESB, the global safe boundary is not transgressed. Okay, next, in the case of just ESB. So the just ESB, in addition to harming people through the reduction in hydrological water cycle, aerosol can also affect the air quality, and it can affect the human health. And right now, in fact, air pollution causes nearly 4 million people per year death, and the majority of that basically the death occurs in low and middle income countries. And so the metric in the case of health, this is slightly different. In the case of the climate problem or the safe boundary, we use AOD, which is basically a metric for aerosol loading. And this PM2.5, it's also a metric for loading, but this basically indicates, the amount of particles with a diameter less than 2.5 micron. That is what is PM2.5. And in fact, in the case of air quality, World Health Organization prescribes only less than 5 microgram per meter cube of PM2.5 is healthy. But in fact, right now, nearly more than 90% of the population is actually exposed to more than this particular World Health Organization prescribed 5 microgram per meter cube. So for this Earth Commission work, we basically prescribed 15 microgram per meter cube, because there are a lot of intermediate targets that WHO prescribes. So we chose basically 15 microgram per meter cube, and even with this, nearly 85% of the global population is actually living, with air pollution that is above this threshold. So, in fact, since PM2.5 and AOD both are aerosol loading measures, one can actually measure simultaneously and correlate that, and one can be converted into other. So when we do that, the regional boundary of regional boundary is 0.25, but if you convert this, just boundary of 15 microgram per meter cube, it can be it becomes basically 17 microgram. So which is 0.17 AOD. So I think what we found is the just boundary is more stricter than the safe boundary. Okay, here is the quick summary. So basically, aerosol have both the climate safe and health implications. And large aerosol loading, basically the way it affects is it affects the hydrological cycle, whether it is on a planetary scale or on a regional scale. Its effect is on the hydrological cycle. So in the case of regional aerosol boundary, we basically quantify that to 0.25 to 0.5 AOD is the upper limit. And so it's already, of course, transgressed in South Asia and East China. For the global boundary, and basically this is by looking at the difference between the two hemispheres, and in this case the boundary is 0.15 and the current boundary is 0.05. So that is why in this case, the global case, it is not transgressed. When you come to health, it is, as I already said, nearly 85% of the population is already exposed to levels that are above this threshold. So basically the just boundary is stricter than the global boundary. That's all. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, that's perfect. Thank you so much, Bala, and thank you to all of our colleagues who have gone through the ESBs for you today. We will also have some digests of this information available for you as you leave. We have some briefs that go through all of those different areas. They're not as detailed as compact, but they try to give you an overview of the headlines of those pieces. So before moving on to our next session, Dr. Magdalena Skipper, who's the editor-in-chief of Nature, who's the journal where Earth System Boundaries for a Just World and Safe Planet will be published later today. And she has this to say.
Good afternoon. It is a great pleasure to be able to contribute virtually to today's events, although of course I wish I could have been with you in person to discuss the analyses and recommendations from Johan Rockström and many colleagues which are being published in Nature today. The stability and resilience of the Earth system and human well-being are inseparably linked, yet their interdependencies are generally under-recognized and they are often treated independently. These are the opening words of the paper published in Nature today, the goal of which is to quantify safe and just Earth system boundaries. The current work builds on the concept of planetary boundaries, which back in 2009 identified safe biophysical boundaries in a Nature publication entitled A Safe Operating Space for Humanity. This concept of planetary boundaries has been extraordinarily influential in a relatively short time, and yet, despite its title, A Safe Operating Space for Humanity, the work back then did not include the justice dimension. The new work extends and synthesizes this planetary boundaries framework, donut economics, at the heart of which lies environmental justice and the Sustainable Development Goals. The justice dimension is defined in this current work in interspecies, intergenerational, and intragenerational terms, which enables the authors to propose a quantitative foundation for safeguarding the global commons for all people now and into the future. What is striking and sobering is that incorporating the justice dimension shows us a much bleaker picture. And arguably the most striking change since 2009 is that now the authors advocate limiting global warming to 1 degree Celsius above pre-industrial levels. This, of course, is lower than the 1.5 degrees target agreed at the 2015 Paris Climate Conference. What lies ahead is a formidable task of minimizing human exposure to significant harm from Earth system change. What is needed is a just global transformation if no one is to be left behind. There is one more thing about this work I wish to emphasize. In the spirit of true scholarship, the authors offer the new Earth system boundaries as, in their words, a transparent proposal for further debate and refinement by scholars and wider society. The analyses and proposal published today provide a powerful example of how science functions when different teams study and refine each other's work. For Nature, both the findings presented in today's publication and the way they were arrived at matter equally. Walking a more just and sustainable path will not be easy, but it can only be done through inclusive collaboration. I hope you will have a productive day of discussions. Thank you very much.
Okay, and on to our next piece. And I will hand over to my colleague Fredrik Norberg, who is the director of Albert Eco, a science communications agency, who will take us through the panel. Thank you, Fredrik.
Thank you, Maya. Is everyone okay? We were talking about a bleak future, and I was thinking about the ocean here, because it's not the focus of this study, but I brought this piece of reef-building coral as a reminder of what we're talking about. I used to be a marine biologist specializing in coral reefs. I just wanted to show this. And it's a reminder of what happens if we cross these Earth system boundaries. Because already at 1.2, we have severe bleaching. This is apparently a bleached coral because it's dead. But this is also what they look like when they suffer from global warming. We also know that corals are suffering from nutrient pollution, another Earth system boundary here. And we also know that if we go past 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming, we will lose up to 90% of all coral reefs. And we also know that 500 million to 1 billion people depend on these coral reefs for livelihood, health, etc., food. And a number of these, a big portion of these 500 million or 1 billion people are poor and marginalized people. So this is a reminder of what we're talking about. I will put it here. All right. So now we're going to have a sort of reflection from some scientists who are not inside the commission. I want to listen to their reflections on what they've heard so far and what they see as the gaps for. Right here, there's some kind of weird sound here. Are we okay? Ah, but I can't see without my glasses. Okay, I'll try. This is going to be interesting. Okay. Am I fine? No, it works. I can put them on when I need to see something. So I will call all these brilliant people who are outside the commission, but also experienced scientists, up one at a time to discuss this and hear some reflections. And the first one that I want to call up on stage is Research Director and Deputy Director of Stockholm Environment Institute. She's an experienced social scientist, an expert on both climate and sustainable development governance. She's an adjunct associate professor, docent, at Linköping University, and right now she's in the process of writing the 2023 UN Global Sustainable Development Report. Åsa Persson, please. Give her a big round of applause. Yes, Åsa, you were involved early on with the planetary boundaries work, and now you're seeing these new Earth system boundaries, and I just want to hear some initial reflections. I will give you like 2-3 minutes to reflect on what you've heard so far. Please.
Thank you. Let me first check that audio is working. Yes. Thank you so much, Fredrik. And first of all, big congratulations to the group of scientists and the support staff working on this really path-breaking paper. I think it's a significant contribution, and we look forward to see how it will be received in the scientific community, of course, but also policy, civil society, business, etc. Yes, I had the privilege of working as a postdoc with the Planetary Boundaries, one of my first projects, working with Johan, coordinating that process, but also at the same time with Joita in EU projects on climate policy, where you really also opened my eyes to equity and justice. So it's very nice to see these come together in such a clear way. And reflecting on the science we just heard, which is very rich, it's very dense, we're going to need some time to really digest all this. I would say the two key contributions that I would also see is exactly what we heard from Magdalena Skipper, the inclusion of justice. And I would really commend the team here for not choosing a simple road, oversimplifying this concept. You know, we are now beyond the sort of allocation of a carbon budget or talking about ecological debts, you know, with a single metric. It is much more complex. So I appreciate how you have a fairly comprehensive framework, many dimensions of justice, because as you pointed out, I think with the whole justice turn, we see from many parts of the world, not just the climate movement, I see it a lot among scientific colleagues. It's not just about distributive justice, but very much about the recognition justice. Who is even at the table when we discuss these things? I think a second contribution is the sub-global boundaries, the focus. I think this is a very clear improvement, evolution from the first planetary boundaries paper. Where I am still curious to hear more, maybe we'll discuss it in the panel, is the interdependencies between the boundaries. So you allude to it, but I think we all need to understand more, you know, how are they interdependent? Is it the case that the area of the safe space is constant and then we exceed one boundary and that means we have less space on another one, or is there another sort of conception? I think we need to understand this better. I also, of course, am very curious about the need for transformation, which is discussed in the paper. Joita, you talked about, you know, major redistribution, for example, these, you know, big important issues, and I think we as scientists need to ensure and take our responsibility to the public, actually funding our research to be even more explicit, discuss, you know, how can this actually be done in practice? What does it mean to demystify transformation a little bit? So maybe I'll stop there, but those are some initial reflections.
Thanks, Åsa. I know we were both involved in a paper trying to scale down the planetary boundaries to the Swedish context. You remember that one? And do you think there's a need now to have sort of those kind of downscaling for a national context, or have they already covered that in their approach?
I mean, I'm also curious. I understand that these boundaries, I mean, there's a whole ecosystem of science-based targets for cities, companies, etc. So I'm sure there are lots of ideas. You're right. We tried early on to downscale the boundaries. It was a very interesting intellectual exercise. To me, though, I'm not. What I took away from this whole experience was also when starting to compare the boundaries with the policies that we had agreed at the international level. It was quite clear that it's not. It was a lot about implementation gaps. So actually, the international community has been very good at producing targets in various declarations, comments, or legal agreements. Actually, 1 year ago, ahead of the Stockholm Plus 50 meeting we had in Stockholm, we reviewed all these targets, and I think we have agreed to over 500 in total. Maybe 250 or so are measurable. There are indicators, and the global community has only managed to make progress, significant progress, on around 10% of these targets. So it's very much about an implementation gap. So in that sense, I think boundaries and targets are needed, but of course we cannot rely on them to lead to action. So I would say I think it's very exciting if we can downscale boundaries, if it's useful for various organizations. But I'm even more excited about how this will inform the wider debate and sort of inform also our politicians when they see the general awareness, hopefully increasing even further, and then take the necessary decisions.
Thanks. All right, so next panelist is a professor at the University of Gothenburg, professor of physical meteorology. And he's internationally known for his extensive climate research and as being a coordinating lead author of the latest IPCC report. Please, Deliang Chen, welcome. Big round of applause, please.
Thank you.
Hey.
stand here.
Okay, so I will sort of give you the same opportunity. Nice.
Yeah.
Bragging here, yeah. So I will give you the same opportunity to give some initial reflections of what you've heard about the Earth system boundaries. Please.
Thanks. And of course, first is my congratulations to all the co-chairs and also colleagues. Especially, I think there are actually two groups of people I'm most grateful. Number one is the international coordinating bodies, and Future Earth is one of these. And because if we don't have this kind of organization, we know that this type of things is of course will be happening, but it's much better to have this international dimension and so on. And the second thing I was thinking about is that this is a very nice building up based on the 2009 UN Rockstone paper and also 2015 with Stefan, etc. in terms of a few things that has been mentioned. And in my eyes, I think the most important impacts of these reports are two. Number one is that it will have an impact on the policy community, and especially at the global scale, international scale. It's like IPCC, you know, without the work of the IPCC, you can not imagine that the Paris Agreement will be reached. The debate about climate change will happen. And you took up much more issues. Climate is one of these, and including much more important issues. I think these are to be seen and to be used at the international discourse, debates, and so on. And we know that we already have the biodiversity, we already have the land from the UN discussions, and I'm missing actually the ocean, you know. So it's good for you to study with the ocean, because when I look at the global issues, I'm missing really two things. One is water. That's why I brought my water bottle from IPCC. One is water. The other is ocean. But I think your work is really fantastic, because you not only create a conceptual framework, but also this time you put some numbers. That is fantastic, I think. As the editor-in-chief of Nature said, you know, it can be discussed, can be extended, can be improved, but that's science. That's also the role the scientific community should be playing. That is also the role for I think, the interdisciplinary bodies like Future Earth should be playing. As Nash opened this event, the academies in the world, around the world, it should be focused on the evidence-based. I mean, this is evidence. You connected all the evidence you have. I'm also happy to see the global dimension you guys have been doing. It's not just people from Stockholm or maybe from Berlin or Potsdam, but anyway, it's fantastic to see also social science is part of it. And that's my first thinking about the impact. The second impact I think I have been thinking is really for the next generation Earth scientists or interdisciplinary scientists. And we probably will discuss more. And what I have been thinking is that for the young people who are still in the university, this provides excellent framework, direction of how to think in a systematic way, and how to maybe build up or gain or obtain your knowledge, and how to think about our common future. I think that will be influential for the decades to come. And especially immediately for the people in the university. I see some young people here, not so many, but it will be useful for you, I guess. And I think I'll stop here, but I would, if you can discuss more.
I guess you're looking around and see a lot of young people. We're all young, right, when it comes to science. We always want to learn new things. I have a specific question for you later on, but I think we will take the opportunity to call the next panelist up on stage. So she is the Chief Executive Officer of MISTRA, the Swedish Foundation for Strategic Environmental Research. She has a PhD in aquatic microbiology at Gothenburg University, and you also worked for the Polar Research Secretariat. We're sitting here in this building then? No, okay. Anna Jöborn, please.
Thank you.
Big round of applause. so nice to have you here. And sorry I had you sneaking behind me and not properly introducing you there. But so
it worked well.
Yeah,
I managed.
Yeah, good. Really nice to have you here. I will give you the opportunity as well to give some initial reflections of what you've heard so far. Yes. Please.
Actually, I will also jump into the ocean. You mentioned the ocean. Several of the speakers spoke about it. And actually, first, congratulations to a really impressive piece of work. And when I read the introduction and the information, actually, I haven't seen the full paper yet. My feeling was the same as when I, as a marine microbiologist, first looked into the microscope. And I was so stunned by all these life in a drop of water. So much different organisms, all these things going on. And the same feeling I have when looking into the planetary boundaries issue, because it's like a macroscope. So you have the same feeling as looking into this diverse world in the ocean when you look at this. And it's also sometimes it's really hard to grasp. And that was my impression when I got the information about including justice also and safe world, that it's so complicated. And as a policymaker, because I've been on the policymaker side, sometimes you just feel a bit tired, and you have really hard time grasping the complexity. And that's why it's so good that you, scientists, do it for us. You actually have the possibility to dig deep, you connect things, you create systems that make it much more easy for us as policymakers to understand this complexity. And I think also, as was mentioned before, I think the next step is to make it practical, operational, because we need both the scientific basis and the system thinking, but we also need to go down to practice. So I'm looking forward to that step, making this idea more operational.
Thanks, Anna. Did MISTRA fund this research?
I'm sorry, we didn't.
Not directly.
Not directly. However,
but indirectly, right?
Indirectly with some of the scientists. That's true. That's true. But actually, as you mentioned it, MISTRA is one of these research funders that look into strategic environmental research. So this is the type of the research we finance, and we have several programs similar to this kind of work, but on national level.
And there's a bunch of Stockholm Resilience Center associated researchers, and that center wouldn't exist without MISTRA, so yeah.
That's right.
Thanks. All right, I have a specific question for you, Deliang, and this is something, how many of you in here have read Ministry for the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson? The first chapters, you get all sweaty. It's for real. You feel the pain of being in this heat wave, where we reach the wet bulb temperature and nobody can cool down, and air conditioning is sort of breaking together, etc., etc. What is the wet bulb temperature? Deliang, could you explain it once for all?
God, this is examination. No, this is as you know, we have a normal temperature. We call it dry temperature, which is energy in the atmosphere. And then the WAPE temperature is a temperature that measures how your body, for example, as human, can evaporate. You know, by evaporation, we cool down. And so that temperature is a description of how good evaporation can happen, or how easy. When you have a high temperature, it's very difficult. And it's also very directly related to human health. You know, when there is a temperature threshold, which we, you know, if we cannot evaporate anymore, sweating anymore, then people can die within days. I think Christy is an expert here. But from what I have read, the people can die within hours to maximum 1 day.
So if you have a sort of high moisture in the air and it's really warm, we cannot sweat and cool ourselves down, and then it's become really problematic. Thanks. Now I finally understand it. So now I want to sort of call up on stage both Johan and Joita. Please come and join us, and we'll try to come over here and see if we can fit with these two tables here. So, thanks again for a great presentation earlier on, and I just want to give you some time to reflect on the reflections on what you've heard. Who wants to start? Johan?
Well, to begin with, perhaps just diving down into the ocean, just to explain that we look forward to address the ocean. We took quite a pragmatic approach here, recognizing from the very start that quantifying safe and just boundaries is such a complex and major scientific challenge that we've recognized we would not be able to address all the 9 planetary boundaries. So we selected these 5, focusing on the biosphere boundaries, climate and air pollution. And we have already lined up novel entities for the next phase, chemicals and the ocean. So we look forward to consult you on that as we move along.
Joita,
so Professor Chen talked about the fact that these are first numbers, maybe they can change, especially the justice numbers. And Asa said also that it's very complex justice. So I just want to tell you a little bit about the process of how do we come up with justice numbers. So in the Earth Commission in 2019, when we started, there was a whole debate, is justice now science? And can we really come up with scientific numbers? And then we had these massive debates amongst the social scientists ourselves. Can we translate justice into units like wet bulb temperature? Can we translate them into units that natural scientists use? Natural scientists asked us, can we really talk about justice? I mean, come on, aren't you going to weaken our science? So, we had to fight with justice scholars, and we had to fight with natural scientists and ecologists. And then in that process, we all learned. We all learned about how the ecosystem can become more just. We learned about how from air pollution, actually, we moved to the aerosol storyline, and we brought these two things together. So it's been a learning process for all of us, and we're not sure we've got the right story, but we've got to start to the story of justice, because justice is very complex, and especially justice on oceans is incredibly complex. I think green water is an area where we did not discuss the justice issues, and my gut feeling says that maybe there are very complex stories with green water in relation to justice. So it's going to be a long battle ahead trying to figure out how to move this discussion further.
And when it comes to justice, it's like the Earth Commission is publishing different strands of this justice in different papers at different times. Can we take that again? Because this current paper focuses on minimizing significant harm, but access to resources is more published in another paper.
Right. So so what we did was we published one paper on the theory of justice as we see it, and then we published a paper on what would happen if in 2018, in an unequal world, we tried to meet the minimum needs of all people who fall below the minimum needs. And then we calculated those. First, we had to find out what does it mean in terms of access to water, how many liters of water, how many calories of food, etc. And then we had to calculate that, so calories of food into how much meat, how much pulses, etc. And then we had to calculate that back into what does it mean in terms of water, energy, phosphorus, nutrients, etc. And then at the end, we found out that if you did meet those basic needs in 2018, you would cross the planetary boundaries. Especially on climate change, but also on the others. So this is for 2018, and so when you project towards the future, you find that that will definitely happen. And of course, technology has a role, but maybe we need to look also at redistribution, because technology alone will not solve it. So that was another chunk of the work that we did. A part of the work that we're now doing, which is under review, is to try to create a corridor. And the corridor is taking the safe and just boundary as the ceiling, and as the floor, we are saying, what happens if we provide all humans on Earth, not just those below, with a minimum amount? And once we provide the minimum amount to everybody, then what is the space that we have left to allocate amongst ourselves? A very complicated story. But it is, in fact, shows us that maybe we don't have such a big corridor. We may have a very narrow corridor if we don't change our production systems and our consumption systems and our investment systems. And so to come back to your transformation story, I'm not going to answer it because Professor Diana Liverman will do that. But it's not like we are avoiding your question.
I think it's worth just kind of reiterating that So the Earth Commission is an international science assessment platform. We recognized that there were many gaps that we needed to fill to be able to do the full synthesis. So that's what Joita says. We developed a theory paper on justice. We have the paper on the climate niches that showed the evidence behind putting the thresholds for justice in terms of climate impact. Dave showed the tipping elements paper, which is also an Earth Commission paper. There will be a whole nature portfolio of papers that is the fundamental, let's say, the new gaps, the gaps that have been filled, apart from the synthesis that are being made, that adds up to the Earth Commission report. Today we published a Nature paper, but Joita also leads a paper that will be hopefully coming in not too far future in the Lancet. So there are there's a whole set of scientific papers here. But the vision is that the Earth Commission becomes an institution, that becomes an international science assessment mechanism for a fully integrated people-planet analysis to complement the work of other global assessment initiatives.
Also, as a social scientist and working with the Stockholm Environment Institute network of scientists, what do you see, what are you up to right now that could contribute to this process?
I mean, I think we need a very broad science spectrum to face the challenges we have. So I think this sort of, again, identifying the boundaries that are safe and just, what we need to do is essential, but it's just as essential to, figure out what we're going to do in practice. So to move from the targets to the action and what are the barriers, etc. So we're now preparing for our next 5-year strategy, and we're really, thinking hard about, should we commit even more to sort of making implementation work? And I think, I remember a couple of years ago, the US hosted, I think it was a major emitters forum, and it was just after the EU had been negotiating its climate targets. And I just felt, we're in this Olympic Games of setting targets, and it's a little bit risky to invest all, time, political capital in just target setting. I wrote my PhD on policy instruments, and a quote I take with me from the literature I was looking at is that, setting the target is an easier task than coming up with the policy instruments, whether it's carbon taxes, whether it's investment support to new green industrial policy, etc. That's where you have often the distributional conflict. So I think, again, we need the full spectrum. We need to constantly update the boundaries and targets. I think it's the duty of science to do this and speak truth to power, but also to focus on implementation. I take it as a challenge, actually, to sort of, whether it's social science, political science, governance in a broad sense, to also form these sorts of science assessment processes and really synthesize, what works in practice. I think the Earth system science has been better, actually, honestly, at this, at sort of getting science together. We are doing a lot of case studies, a lot of proliferation, but we really need to synthesize the key lessons.
Thanks, Åsa. Deliang, from an IPCC perspective, will this sort of add complexity to that process? Were you 51 authors on this study and in total? But you are many, many more, of course, in the IPCC process. What do you think? How can this sort of Earth system boundaries feed into the IPCC process?
Well, I think climate is one of the elements that has been discussed here. So for that part, definitively all the literatures will be going into the IPCC assessment. And assessment is a key word here. I think Åsa said correctly that that is also most powerful output from scientific community. So I have been working for IPCC for the last 20 years or so in different capacities. So what I have seen is that that is really the best way science can organize ourselves, community, get the voice in a systematic way, and also to help the policymakers to understand. We are still not there yet, with the SIC report, and I hope you will get maybe some shorter policy brief, because that is a challenge, the communication part. But otherwise, I think that will be a part of that the background material for IPCC to digest and to read, reflect on the use also. And I think it's IPCC, as you know, that this time has been trying to not look at the climate change itself, impacts, and mitigation separately. We try to kind of build a system to really close the loop, which, as I see, this group has been doing this already from the beginning. That is Earth system science thinking. And that part, I don't know if IPCC has been influenced by that kind of thinking or whatever. I think this kind of thinking is really necessary to have the policymakers in the beginning or in the process, and to have the impact people. And I'm really looking at what you have been doing is not only the Earth system, but also people, society, and economics, etc. All these are something that IPCC, as I think, has been evolving, has been trying to achieve that also. So definitively we can learn from each other. IPCC can learn from this process, and you can maybe also look at the IPCC process, which is quite a rigid, quite a, I would say, systematic process. There are people who are studying IPCC process, by the way. So. And as a coordinating leader also, we have been interviewed regularly by people, and they are studying. I guess there are some lessons to be learned and for this work also.
Thanks. It seems also from this discussion that we need new kind of science and maybe some new kind of scientists that are transdisciplinary. Anna, from your perspective, how can you support that as a funder in Sweden?
I think scientists have never been as important for society as now. So, I mean, it's a rocky road we are traveling on, that's for sure. So we need handrails, we need Sherpas, we need scientists speaking honestly with integrity, and also challenges, truths that you come up with new ideas when you collaborate between natural scientists, engineers, and social scientists. And I think it's so important at this step. So I wouldn't say that we need new types of scientists, but a new way of collaborating and working together. And this is an example of such a thing that happens across the globe. And that's something I really appreciate and encourage. And as a research financer, that's the focus of what we do. We try to create these kind of platforms and also fill in the gaps, be ahead of the curve, identify what is missing in the system. And we are a foundation, so we have quite a lot of freedom as financiers, but I also encourage other research financiers to find ways of collaborate, because sometimes we are creating real problems for you as scientists when you apply for money. We nitty-gritty, the administrative hinders for collaborating. So we need to do our homework as financiers as well. And I will bring this back to Mistra.
Thanks. Johan?
Yeah, just one thing, just to kind of think a little bit ahead. I inspired so much by your comment here, Deliang, as well. I mean, I see, and I think many of us here share, that there are very clear scientific trend lines in the world. And one is the integration of the biosphere and the climate. I mean, that I think is very clear. And the IPCC 6 assessment is so clear that it won't be enough to just phase out fossil fuels to hold the Paris range. We also need to uphold the resilience in the biosphere. So it's kind of a Earth Commission IPCC interconnection already. Another trend line is very clear that we have to become stewards of the entire planet. There's no way of disconnecting that. And the third one is, of course, the full people-planet integration. These are 3 very clear thrusts, which I think will be guiding the whole sustainability and the whole, beyond Agenda 2030 agenda as we move ahead. And then finally, just on a little practical issue, just to hand it back to you, Deliang, how inspired we have been by the IPCC. I mean, as a very practical issue, we will be in the second phase of the Earth Commission launching the Tipping Point Model Intercomparison Project, the TIP-MIP, inspired by the IPCC. Would you have over 20 MIPs going on? The Model Intercomparison Projects already registered at the World Climate Research Program. And that will be, we hope, a real foundational contribution between IPCC and the Earth Commission. So we really want to work along exactly this methodological, scientific assessment, but really get the social and natural sciences fully on board together.
And we also see some interesting sort of collaborations between IPCC and the IPBES panel for biodiversity,
Absolutely.
and even common reports, etc. And maybe that is something where the Earth Commission can collaborate even more with both of these, and maybe we will have common COPs in the future, both for biodiversity and climate. Who knows? All right, time flies when you're having fun, and I just want to give you an opportunity, all of you, to give one final short, really short, sort of sentence on advice. If we were talking about young people here, so thinking about the science we need ahead, if we have some young scholars here, even students, how do you think they can best contribute to the science needed in the coming 20, 30 years to help us stay within these Earth system boundaries? Who wants to start? Really fast, Johan.
Well, I would say to continue advancing the safe and just space for humanity. Simple as that.
All right.
I would say that young students need to take a T-shaped approach, so they need to make sure that they publish in their own fields as long as the whole scholarship arena doesn't change, and at the same time they need to try to see if they can publish interdisciplinary work, so in their own field as well as interdisciplinary, and hope that both work, and if both work, then they have a future.
All right, T4, good, thanks. Åsa?
I think we have not talked so much yet about, you know, the benefits of transitioning, staying within the safe spaces. It's not all about burden sharing or so on, but you know, how do we equitably share the benefits of transitioning, and in terms of technological innovation, etc. So I hope this also inspired a lot of innovation science, if I can say that.
Thanks. Daliang?
Yeah, Joita, you took my point. No, I can add one more point. That is, I think, to keep a global dimension is so important for young people, that we very often think in a narrow way. And I can see the trend, very obvious now, developing around the world, more nationalistic, etc. That will not help when we're going to solve the global issues. I had a very good discussion with Anna about Mistral and so on. For example, focusing on Sweden is good, but I think international dimension is something we should not forget. Otherwise, we will not be able to solve the problem.
Thanks, Daliang. Anna?
I really encourage every young person to get involved in this, because we need you along on the boat, to refer back to the ocean, because we need you. And these people here have created really good platforms for you to work on. So welcome.
Thanks. And with that, we have to close this panel. Give them all a big hand. Thanks to Johan, Joita, Åsa, Daliang, Anna. Thanks.
Hello, everybody. Thank you. I think we are nearly all back in the room. Cecilia, do we have everyone? Yes? Good. So we're going to go on to the next section, which is going to explore a bit more about, okay, now we know more about the boundaries. Well, how do we actually live within them? What are some of the results and investigations that the Commission has looked at there? I did have a great point that was just made to me that I wanted to also just clarify for this group as well, that whilst we have a number of researchers on stage today, that's not everybody. I think you know the number of 51 different researchers, but we've actually also got a lot of postdocs, early careers researchers who have been working tirelessly with this group as well over the last 2 years. So I just wanted to see if of us, everybody, all of our researchers, if you wanted to put your hand up. There we go. Across, yeah. For a bit of a round of applause. So this is broader than we can get fitting into one afternoon. But with no further ado, I'm going to hand over to Shumei Bai, who is going to discuss operationalizing the ESBs for cities and business. Please, Shumei, welcome. Yeah.
Can you hear me? Okay, great. Thank you. So what are we going to do with all these boundaries once they are set, right? What I would say that these ESBs really need to be linked to actors if they are going to have any bearing in real world and to guide the practice. So we can do that by cross-scale translation, try to bring down this planetary level kind of boundaries into actors, cities and businesses in particular. So when we talk about this cross-scale translation, what we are talking about is if the boundary is transgressed, then what we are talking about is how do you allocate the responsibilities equitably. And then if it is not transgressed, probably how you can actually share some of the remaining spaces. Not that we have to share everything up to the ceiling, but that's roughly the two different kind of sharing here. So why we have to talk about cities and companies so much? Because we have so many other stakeholders. And this is because, one is because they are the main generator of the impacts. And the second is because of their agency. The cities and companies, they are really the kind of actors that we think they can take some of the nimble actions, and very often ahead of even the national government, and also before some of the formal regulatory systems are put in place. And this is why we are focusing on them. And I think this is really important given that the urgency of our situation. So translation can serve multiple purposes, basically about, informing the actors how much you need to do in order for us as a society to stay collectively within the sort of boundaries. And one of the very important endpoint of this translation is the science-based target setting. And we know that this kind of science-based target setting sort of work because from our analysis of several thousand companies, we have seen that those companies that do have science-based target, they have the most ambitious target. And then those companies who have target, but not really exactly following the science-based target setting, they have less ambitious one. But both of these companies, groups of companies, they have much more ambitious target than their national counterpart. So this really shows the importance of mobilizing these subnational actors. But unfortunately, this translation is a very complex process, and this is a nascent sort of area with many knowledge gaps. And here are some of the knowledge gaps we identified here. For example, we really need to develop a common sort of procedure so that not every actor just do translation as they like. And also, we do need to focus on interaction. We do need to acknowledge some of the dynamics, and we need to allocate for justice and equity. And we also need to support the monitoring and accountability, and also establish some of the governance mechanism. We cannot always just rely on some of the voluntary activities that some of the front-runner cities and businesses are taking up. And also we do need to design incentive systems so that more people, more cities and more business will be incentivized actually to do this. So our work of Working Group 5 within this Earth Commission, which I have been leading, really has been focusing on filling some of these knowledge gaps. And one of the first steps we have tried to do is to come up with principles for this translation. So we have come up with 10 principles of translation. 6 of them are really about the translation process, and probably 4 of them are more focusing on the translated sort of outcome. So I wouldn't have time to go into detail, but these principles include, for example, scientifically rigorous, and they really need to be transparent, they need to be just, and they need to address systematic issues, and they need to be sufficiently safe. What do we mean by sufficiently safe here is that I think some previous presenters talked about the implementation gap. So here, sufficiently safe, we mean even if, for example, assuming 20% or even 30% of those people who have set target, actually they're going to fail. They wouldn't be able to achieve the target. So we probably need to incorporate this sort of safety sort of boundary into the target setting from the very beginning. So this is what we mean sufficiently safe here. And of course, they need to be context-specific, sensitive, and they probably need to be more enabling and incentivizing rather than punishing and, having, And also they need to be dynamic and time-bound. We need to revisit them as the social situations change. And also they need to be, as much as possible, synergetic. So we have identified that translating Earth system boundaries involves several key steps. For example, first of all, we have these safe and just Earth system boundaries. They're mostly about the Earth system state. So we really need to transcribe this into anthropogenic pressure so that we can actually allocate this sort of pressure into the shares. So again, this paper is still under revision, which will be published hopefully by Lancet Planetary Health. So once we have this transcribed boundary, then we can have this choice of sharing approaches. And then we have this initial allocation of budget or responsibilities. But very often, these initial steps of allocation wouldn't be sufficient to really reflect the context or the justice principles. So we probably need several reiterative adjustments before we can actually arrive at the final translated share of budget and responsibilities. And once this kind of final share of budget and responsibilities are identified, then actors can use them to do various things. For example, like, for the purpose of reporting, for the purpose of benchmarking, for their risk management, and also very importantly, science-based target setting. So here we can see that the choice of these sharing approaches is one of the most important steps in cross-scale translation. And it is also the one step that actually carries explicit or very often implicit value judgment, which directly influence the outcome, whether the outcome of translation is actually fair or just, and could also be open for influence or even manipulation by different actors. So I think it is very important we get this really right. So we started by conducting literature review on these sharing approaches, and we found about 40 different studies. And this figure put these 40 studies across different specific Earth system domain, and then across different sharing principles. So you can immediately identify some obvious patterns here. We can see legacy or grandfathering in other terminology is very often used, and also the basic need preference or equality or economic contributions are the most used sharing approaches, whereas more forward-looking ones, for example, the capability or resource efficiency or green incentive or development right, are not as often used in these existing sharing studies. So another one that is very obvious from this pattern is that most of these studies are about are stopping at the country level, and very, very few of them are about cities or businesses. So this really points to the need to develop these methodologies. Sorry, I'm trying to go back, but it's not going back. Is it? Oh, sorry. Okay, this is going back. Yeah. Great. So as our first sort of attempt to really develop a protocol of cross-scale translation, I think we have identified several sort of key steps in doing that, decision point in doing that. And our review and analysis really revealed that the choice of sharing approach, as we just talked about, is so important. And there are several different factors actually influence the suitability of different sharing approaches. And those include what kind of Earth system domain we're talking about, what kind of spatial construct that particular boundary has adopted to come up with a boundary, and what is the status? Is it transgressed or not transgressed? And what is the regenerative sort of nature? Is this recharged every year, or is it taking like forever or even impossible to recover? And what is the temporal perspective? Do you want to go back and then try to understand who's the most responsible one that has caused the problem? Or do you want to focus on current or even forward-looking, say, for example, like the development right or, green incentives, those sort of things? So once going through these sort of steps, you have a pool of appropriate sharing approaches, and this will be put into the consideration of justice, equity, and the socioeconomic context. And then we'll arrive at the final choice of sharing approaches, and this will also be constrained and informed by the availability of data and matrix. And then after all this is done, we can have this allocated share. So the one thing that we have really learned through this kind of exercise is that the complexity and the vital importance of being transparent. So, and that includes, uncertainties of the result. What is the value judgment that goes under or beneath that particular choice, and what kind of context we've been talking about, and what kind of justice considerations we have considered in doing so. And so, for example, we know that all sharing approaches and the choice of them in translation, they do carry the value judgment and uncertainties, but this is very often not spelled out in those studies we have reviewed. And no single translation approach can really address all of these uncertainties or the nuances, context, or equity or justice, which is why some of the reiterative adjustment probably will be needed for translation. And there's also a need to establish common principles and further the protocols for transparency and credibility. And of course, governance structure is really essential. We need to put in the regulatory systems, incentives, accountability, and benchmarking, and all these things need to be further developed. And of course, this really points to the broader systematic transformation because no city or cities or businesses, they can do this alone. They are always embedded in the much broader socioeconomic and ecological systems of governance and many other systems. So this is really calling for a system-wide sort of transformation. So I would really like to highlight one particular sort of unexpected kind of discovery through our process is the importance of not only setting target by individual actors, but also getting them to collaborate together. So what we have focused on here is we looked at the 200 most largest emitter cities in the world, and then we looked at the 500 companies that are the largest emitter. And what I found is that many of them actually co-locate. And this is very interesting because many of the cities, I think about more than half of these 200 largest emitter cities, they do have this net zero target. But many of these global 500 largest emitter companies that are located in the city with their headquarters, they don't have any net zero sort of target. And this is something very important that we have to notice, because these headquarters, they themselves, they don't have any, much emission, but they have the power to make the decision that can influence a whole lots of, business ecosystem and then change the practice of them. But this has never really been focused on or tapped into. So what we are trying to advocate here is that actually before that, to identify or quantify the potential of what if these cities can persuade the companies that are having the headquarters in their city to actually bring the ambition abreast with each other. What is the potential? And we found that there is a quite large potential if we can do that. And this work is still under revision with nature sustainability. But this is really, I'm showing this to you to really trying to say it is very, very important that in setting target even, it is very important to collaborate with each other, rather than just setting target for yourself. So I think I will stop there. Thank you.
Am I on? Okay, great. Well, good afternoon. I do want to acknowledge that most of the work I did as an Earth Commissioner was on the unceded land of Native Americans in the southwestern United States, and Indigenous rights and vulnerabilities feature quite largely in the way we think about justice for the Earth Commission. So I'm going to talk about two things. One is the work we're doing on transformation, and also to talk a little bit more about the work we've done on the importance of access of the poor to well-being, the needs for well-being. And the access work has been published, Ramet et al. The work on transformation is been done over the last year, and those of you who have published in journals know that it takes months, if not years, of working on a paper to get it published. And in the time that we've been thinking about transformation, there's been a veritable tsunami of scientific articles published, and I feel as though we're constantly needing to update our thinking because there's such wonderful work being published, and a lot of the work of the Earth Commission is based on the work of hundreds of other scientists whose work that we're trying to synthesize. So, two questions. What changes do we need to stay within or return to a corridor? And what I'm going to talk about are the deep systemic changes. And then what are the implications of meeting the needs of the poorest in terms of pressures on the Earth system and also in terms of transformation? And I do want to remind us all that talking about justice and protecting the Earth system, it's something that has been internationally agreed upon within the Sustainable Development Goals. So we're not coming up with, in a sense, something that the international system hasn't talked about. What we're trying to do is to provide some scientific basis for actually moving ahead on the SDGs. So a whole bunch of the SDGs are about eradicating poverty and providing access to resources for well-being. That underpins our approach to just access, but they also seek to protect the Earth system. And this, of course, reflects the Earth Commission approach to Earth system stability and safety. And in the 2030 agenda that the countries agreed to, there are many mentions of the need for transformation, but not very many specifics about how that would happen. So briefly, the work we've done on access, there are about 700 million people who currently live in terrible conditions. They don't have good health, they don't have access to clean water, they don't live with basic dignity, and it's very hard for them to escape from poverty. So the question we asked is, what would be the Earth system impacts if we prioritized them first, if we gave them access to the energy, food, water, and infrastructure that they need? And then if that makes further pressures on the Earth system, how could we actually meet their needs without putting added pressure on the Earth system? So Joyita actually went through this very rapidly in the answer to a question. We looked at 4 basic aspects of well-being: food, water, energy, and infrastructure, looking at housing and mobility. We looked at income distribution as a proxy to estimate how many people lacked access to those basic needs. We then reviewed the literature, particularly UN standards, to come up with estimates of what is needed for decent living, and then what is needed at a second level to escape from poverty. We then converted those resource needs into pressures on the Earth system, and we've looked at estimates for 2018, which has already been published, and 2050, which is a publication now under review, where we assumed a population of 9 million people. And this is the graph from the article we've already published, led by Krellis Rammelt. And what it shows is that for and we only looked at a subset of the Earth system boundaries, but for nitrogen and phosphorus, for land, which we used as a proxy for the biosphere, and for water, giving all of those people a dignified life only increases the pressure on Earth system's boundaries modestly, although that's a problem since all of those boundaries have already been exceeded, so it makes the challenge harder. But for climate change, bringing all those people out of poverty into some minimum level of well-being could have quite serious implications for increased greenhouse gas emissions. So we've then been looking, we briefly discussed this in the published paper, but we have a lot more that will be coming out on that, is we did what you could think of as thought experiments, which were based on these access estimates. And so the first thing we look at is what would happen if we increase the consumption of the poor to a minimum level and bring the consumption of the rich or the high consumers down to that. It's not the minimum level, it's the access to, the escape from poverty. Another thought experiment would be to say, rather than bring everybody down to this quite low level of consumption, what would happen if you took like the highest 3 income deciles and brought them down just to the one below, which wouldn't be quite as dramatic reallocation. And in fact, both of those, I think that we will be showing that by reducing consumption and reallocating it, that allows access for the poor, and it means we can pull back from transgressing Earth system boundaries. How we do that, I'll talk a little bit about in a minute. The other thing that we were asked to do by some reviewers of an article that's in review was not just to look at population change by 2050, but perhaps also do a thought experiment around technology change. So we have now done an estimate that assumes technology improvements towards lower environmental impact, like lower carbon technologies. And if that happens, then there's less pressure on Earth system boundaries, even without reallocation. And some people who we've talked to have said, well, this is very revolutionary and it's not going to be acceptable. So we have been thinking about how there are lots of existing strategies for reducing and reallocating consumption. And I've just listed some of them here that are common across the world at different levels. Taxation, graduated pricing. I live in a city where if you increase your water use above a basic level, you get a much higher water bill, and that has successfully reduced per capita consumption, Tucson, Arizona. There's voluntary reductions in consumption that are already widespread. Information, labels, recycling and reuse, moves to plant-based diets. Public service provision and subsidies to the poor help bring people out of poverty, especially if those subsidies are for low environmental impact escapes from poverty. There are more contentious legal strategies where you can reallocate consumption through lawsuits, through addressing rights, through giving people reparations, land reform in terms of the use of land. Regulations that actually impose consumption caps, and then, of course, investment in technologies that allow for low carbon and nature-positive consumption. Not all consumption is bad. Some consumption has much higher environmental impacts than others. So, moving from access to our thinking about transformation, we apply our justice lens or our justice framework to thinking about the systemic transformations that we may need in order to retreat from boundaries or reallocate access. And those have got to be just both in the means by which we achieve a safe and just future and the ends. And so the principles are allowing access for the poor as part of transformation, reducing pressures on Earth system boundaries, which would in turn reduce the harm that we talked about earlier this afternoon. We need to make sure that the responses are just, including the setting of targets. And I'll just give some ideas about how we're thinking about that. For systemic transformation, we need to look at the deep drivers of Earth system change and inequality, whether that's governance, whether that's consumption, whether that's values. And the whole goal here is to provide and identify a safe and just corridor to the future. So at the moment, we're looking at 4 key areas of transformation, which are drawn from this literature that is changing almost every week. And we do assume that transformations are systemic, deep, and focus on the fundamental drivers of Earth system change and inequality. And we contrast those to transitions, which are often sectoral and focus more on immediate drivers. So some of the examples that Chris gave about water, we might think of as transitions rather than getting at those deeper drivers of consumption of water. Oops, sorry. Going back. Yeah, so the 4 transformations we're looking at are consumption, which is somewhat focused on per capita consumption, but you could also think of it as the consumption of a city or the consumption of a corporation. And there we're looking at reductions and reallocation. It involves changing behaviors and changing values. And we contrast that to changing fundamental economic systems, where some of the degrowth literature, for example, looks at focusing our economic systems on what we need to use rather than on profit and accumulation and investment, using alternative indicators of economic success, trying to control unjust and unsafe accumulation and investment like land grabs or mining, for example. Technology is obviously an important area for transformation. It needs to be sustainable with low environmental impact, but it also needs to be accessible to promote access. And then finally, a very overarching issue is the question of governance. How do we create governance at all levels, from the international to the local, that will transform consumption economies and technologies, and that will ensure fair allocation both of access, of responsibilities, and of rights. And then just briefly, we also need to look at how those transformations can be just in themselves, how the setting of targets can be just. And there's a growing research literature that talks about the potential trade-offs and injustices associated, and I've just given a few examples of transitions and transformations that have been proposed. So how do we deal with job losses in carbon-intensive sectors? How do we make sure that carbon offsetting is legitimate and just? Because there's a literature and a media coverage emerging showing that a lot of the net zero commitments are implicitly relying on carbon offsets which are not being implemented in a just or legitimate way. The debate about half-Earth conservation, some of the debates that came out of the meeting in Montreal about how to ensure that protecting land is just, does not encroach on the rights of Indigenous people or on food supply. Bioenergy is another solution or a transition option that, if we're going to use land for fuel, may undermine food security. Mining of rare earth minerals has been linked to the growth of renewables, which is an important transition, but can have environmental impacts. And then even as we look at adapting, for example, to climate change, there's a growing literature on if you don't design your adaptation projects, they can create new injustices. So this is probably work that we'll be looking at going forward, but it's very important to think about as we set the target targets and as we look at transformation. And I'll just end with a list of some of the relevant papers, many of which are already available, some of which we hope to release in the next few months. Thank you.
Thank you, Diana. Thank you. And David, please. Welcome David Abura to the floor. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to be with you here this afternoon. So what I'll talk about is one of the applications of our work, which Diana just mentioned, and this was at the COP, the Biodiversity COP in Montreal last December, which I'm sure many of you were involved in as well. And this was a chance for us to demonstrate or explore the implications of the work that we have been developing. And this is about, can we have a nature and people positive future? Now, you've seen parts of this slide already. Peter presented the work from our Biosphere Working Group. And what I'm particularly excited about in the work that we're doing, so I'm a coral reef scientist, so I appreciated Frederick's coral on the table there. But the degree of use that we have in coral reef areas in poor tropical locations is very high, and the dependence of people on these ecosystems is immense, as is their value for biodiversity, of course, and their productivity. And how do we balance that out? Many of the things we need to do for coral reefs, we need to do in broader systems and in an African context, while of course, you know, the ocean responses are very important in bringing in the oceans. The solutions we need on land are much more immediate in Africa than we need in the ocean. And so landscapes like that one at the top, you know, are completely degraded. This is my ride to the airport whenever I come out to meetings like this, is through this landscape where the soils are just completely depleted. And I think this work on functional integrity and how to try and keep a balance or high enough function in landscapes and seascapes is, I think, of the greatest importance. And this is work that Elwaz in the back has done and pulled together. And we're waiting for the full publication, but some of these results are, of course, in the Nature one about to come out. Peter already showed this map showing the distribution of functional integrity across terrestrial spaces. The white that you see there, the deserts and the far north and the tundra, those are intact landscapes, so they're not classified in this map. But this shows lands that go from dark purple, high integrity, down to yellow and green at the low integrity areas. I'll show a highlight from East Africa because this is where I live. And what this map really shows in Kenya is that most of our landscapes are, we don't have much intact sort of nature left in a country like Kenya now. A lot of the country is dry, there's pastoralism, the more fertile areas are highly farmed. But most of the country does still have high integrity, and that's important. And that's a great potential for solutions rather than thinking about the negative parts of the story. And what's important here, coming from the conservation community, is how do we maintain this high integrity? How do we conserve biodiversity across lands and seascapes? Not just thinking about, you know, those intact spaces and the protected areas where nature is still intact and people's impact is very low, but how do we really work on the places where people live? How do we make nature count in people's everyday lives so that they value it and they take actions to maintain it and restore it? So this graph, this is a paper very much, 2021. We're in the process of our Earth Commission work, but I prepared this paper with a group of African scientists really trying to contribute to this discourse and leaders of NGOs and things like that, trying to make an argument for shared spaces conservation. So this graph shows, say, the proportion of a national territory that is intact on the left up to degraded on the right. It's a different scale from the one we use in the integrity map because it came out before we had that. But in Kenya, for example, we had 8% of our land under protected areas, that red bar over there. And in Target 3, in the new Global Biodiversity Framework, we're supposed to go up to 30% of protection. It's a global target. Different countries will go for different levels. But how do you ramp up the ambition in countries like Kenya to have more protection? So in this model, those dark green bars are what you would go up to 17%. That was a target in 2020. But then to go from 17% up to 30%, we tried to imagine how you would do that across all spaces. So not just focusing in the highly intact biodiversity areas on the left in this graph, but spreading conservation actions across all territories. And this is something that this functional integrity result that we had, where you, in this case, there was literature out beforehand that suggested 20% landscape under natural vegetation is good. We have identified 25% as being a better number. But how do you motivate conservation in those areas? So to ramp up investment in conservation in Kenya. Of course, we can still ramp up more protected areas, better protection, better management across the less populated, more highly functional places that are more remote. This could be in protected areas, but there's not much appetite in a country like Kenya for government control of space anymore. There's a lot of appetite for community conservation areas under these other effective conservation measures that the CBD process is now promoting. So there's certainly potential for that. But really what we need to focus on is across landscapes where people are living at increasing population densities. What will it mean for them to have better protection, to have more restoration of vegetation and natural habitats in their spaces? And this is where I think really the rubber will hit the road on really getting to implementation in the new biodiversity framework, is making sure that conservation really works for people. And you could get up to this total of 30% by spreading effort across all landscapes. Of course, at the higher end there, it won't be fully intact. You won't have as much biodiversity benefits, but that can return over time. With restoration, you do it right, of course, you can increase the value for conservation over time. And thinking about climate change, of course, which we have to do together, you have to think about what will the climate be in 30 years or 50 years in order to have high function vegetation across landscapes at that point in time, not about what it was in the past. So this is a way that we think the work that we've done can really contribute to really ramping up investment in conservation and commitments, not just from national governments, but coming down to local governments, because of course this has to happen at local levels. If we want to have this 20 to 25% semi-natural vegetation per square kilometre across landscapes, of course that's what landowners have to invest in. So how do we make nature positive, this ambition for improved conservation, people positive? Now this was a graph on sort of for motivating commitments to this target 3, building up to the convention. We put out this paper now from our working group in the Earth Commission with collaborators, really showing that to get from grey, business as usual, to the yellow, which is conservation actions, we really need a lot more than just biodiversity conservation, which is the yellow one. You need actions on drivers of decline. And there were 3 areas that we felt there were deficiencies. So the first, really to take responsibility for direct and indirect drivers. We need a lot more honesty and realism about the inertia and responsivity of biodiversity to recovery. It takes many decades for that recovery to happen. And the equitable outcomes are really emphasized by our work in the Earth Commission. And this inter- and intra-generational justice is a key platform. In that paper, we put out these 6 actions, where the ones on the left really address the biodiversity actions in reducing drivers. The ones on the right are the 3 areas of equity that we really need investment in moving forward. And then now that we finally have our results coming out, with a Nature paper coming out in just a short amount of time, finally, we really would like to now move from trying to influence the discourse in the negotiations of the convention and the framework to how do you move forward in implementation. I think 2 areas are really important. One is that, we have this result where we say that 50% of land spaces is natural or intact, recognizably so. There will be some impacts, of course. That's a lot more than the 30% that is wanted under protection. So how do we really validate work on that 50%? It's not just about 30% protection, which is a legal thing, but about keeping systems intact. And then there's 25% of healthy habitat per square kilometre across all remaining spaces in countries. And then, of course, the work we want to do in phase 2 is on the ocean. What are the numbers that make sense for oceans, the coastal zones in particular, but then also the open ocean? So thank you.
Thank you, David. Can you hear me? Thank you. So if I'm edging closer to everybody to try and make sure that all speakers, that we can get through everything today. So first of all, we're going to move into the next panel set of reflections shortly. But first, I want to invite Jane Madrick to the floor. Jane is the Chief Executive of the Global Commons Alliance and has just joined in May this year. She has the, let me just push this forward. So the Earth Commission is the scientific cornerstone of this alliance. So it's fantastic to have you here with us today, Jane. Thank you.
Thank you, Maya. And I'm delighted to be here. And I've been asked to be short, even shorter than the 5 minutes. So I'll try my best. First of all, huge congratulations to all those involved in bringing this science together. 3 years, but I bet it's a lot of people years and overwork to make that happen. It's fascinating in terms of the science. It is also groundbreaking and perhaps ground shaking. I hope so. And how do I look at this, or how does the Global Commons Alliance look at this? I would say not with despair, but that this actually gives hope, because it sets out the contours, the safe and just zone, measurable pathways that can be translated to trigger action. So it really fills my heart with joy, as well as really tantalizes my mind. So the Global Commons Alliance, of course, has come about because not enough has been happening. You know, the governmental processes have not been effective enough or fast enough to really tackle the problems. So this is an alliance of a different nature, of non-state actors who are really coming together, not to form a new organisation, but to work together in new and innovative ways so that people can better share and steward the global commons. So in a sense, Global Commons Alliance can be seen as an engine for this inclusive collaboration that's been talked about this afternoon. So we're about changing minds, changing actions, and changing systems. And in terms of this Earth systems science, this is a cornerstone of the work of the Alliance. It's the underpinning science. And our job now is to help translate this science into actionable measures and pathways to make it operational. So it's a big challenge. What I could say from my own perspective, from what I've heard this morning, might be some of the implications of this. And well, I didn't see it until this morning, so forgive me. This is not complete, just a few thoughts. So I know from my 30-something years of working at the intersect of water, nature, land, climate, and humanitarian work that there's no environmental security without social justice. It's not possible. All those approaches to keep people out have failed. But I would also say there's no social justice, really, without bringing the environment and the natural processes back into better condition. These are interdependent. So I'm delighted that we have a framework which is both environmentally safe and socially just, joined up. But I do feel we've got a long way to go to translate that into real action. What I think it means is about a fair distribution of rights and opportunities, including those who are the poorest and most affected, most vulnerable by changes to the Earth systems. And I want to emphasize that we don't see these people as the victims of the change. I rather see them as the potential change agents for a better, a safer, a more just planet. It's my experience that it's exactly these people who are living on the margins of society, who have the closest dependency on nature, the best understanding of nature, actually, and the natural systems, and who, with just a little encouragement and access to knowledge, resources, tools, and decision-making, can be change agents for their landscape and beyond. So the implication of the Safe and Just framework, I think, is that we really need some new collaborations, and that's including within the Global Commons Alliance. We need humanitarian development, health, partners to help us think along how to translate this into practice. And I would say also the nature conservation organizations need to come out of their bunker as well. You know, nature positive is fantastic, but it needs to be nature and people positive. And for that, there needs to be learning and real collaboration with these other sectors. And that doesn't just mean even just at the targets level, but in all the operational frameworks, methodologies. There needs to be adjustment. There is movement in this way, but a long way to go. Second point that really struck me is the interdependency of these Earth systems when we come to think about action to address those. And so I think the next publication will be just as important as this one, because I know that's really going to highlight the key ones. We need connected pathways to really succeed to bring the Earth back into a safe and just condition. So I could just focus perhaps on the water aspect, because that's something I've worked a lot on. Currently, water is seen and talked about and managed as some kind of commodity. And I think what this science means is we need to really see it more as water systems. And these water systems include the ecosystems which are capturing, storing, regulating, and distributing that water to people. So the hundreds of millions of dollars that are invested in trying to bring access to all might just fall over if some of that money doesn't go back into restoring the watersheds, which are ensuring that that water will survive into the future. We need to tackle water alongside land, reversing land degradation so that it can better bring the water in. And we need the wetland systems back in better condition. Sweden's lost 80% of its wetlands, I heard this morning. That's about the global average. And these are the connectors between the terrestrial and water environments and the ocean. You heard from Professor Gordon this is happening in the next phase. I'll hold you to that. So we need to bring these together in the translation so that action can be effective. What you also notice from the science we've seen is how agriculture really is underpinning a lot of the movement in the wrong direction. So our Systems Change Lab tells me there's around 70 transformations needed. But I would say that transforming the food systems and our approach to that and what it means globally and locally has got to be pretty high on the list, because this is really going to hold up progress on the nutrients, the water and the biosphere otherwise. So agriculture can be a force for good, but again, we need new partnerships, new thinking, challenge the old approaches to turn this around. And that's really quite a task because the lobby groups are very strong to keep business as usual. And in that sense, reflecting on the global biodiversity framework, you know, most of the focus is on the 30 by 30, the protect and restore nature. But I think what this Earth system science is saying is that we need perhaps to give more attention, or at least as much attention, to that 70%. And that nature doesn't just belong in protected areas, we need nature across the landscape. So we need some different thinking here. We certainly need huge attention on the role that companies can play to turn this around. And there is enthusiasm there. And we need a big push on landscape regeneration, how to bring managed and intact nature together in landscapes that can also be the engines of a thriving economy. What are the design principles? How do we bring the stakeholders together and make this real and upscale? So these are just some of my reflections. What I hope for now is that there will be some immediate impact from this science. I hope that it's a wake-up call, that it will encourage civil society to put even more pressure on the politicians to take the right decisions. And those who are hesitating at the moment, like in the EU over the nature restoration law, might just push them to do the right thing. Or in the Netherlands, dare I say it, to tackle the massive nitrogen emission problem, which is stalled. So to push for the right decisions, seeing the bigger picture, to galvanize new thinking and new partnerships, as I've mentioned, and ultimately to reorientate the economic and financial systems so that they really motivate and incentivize addressing these Earth system boundaries. So the Global Commons Alliance is extremely proud of this publication, everything behind it and everything that it stands for. And we're really looking forward to work with the big team who've put this together and our wider partnership to help translate it into action. Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks, Jane, for reminding us that we need to be both people and planet positive, and also talking about how we can turn this science into some real impact. And that's actually what will happen in the next panel that I will introduce to you briefly. So I was looking in my archives the other day, and I found almost 20-year-old paper from, it's called Metro. It was a daily sort of newspaper that was handed out for free in Stockholm and other cities in Sweden. And what I found there was an interview with, can I get that slide, please? If you have it, next slide. This was what I found in this paper. It's an interview that me and Line Gordon, who is now the director of Stockholm Resilience Center, did with Will Steffen. He was quite sad because he couldn't do the Viking Arena and skating on the lakes because they were not frozen any longer when he was living in Sweden. And what struck me, this is both to pay a tribute, of course, to Will Steffen, but also that we knew so many of these things already 20 years ago. And if we look at all these sort of great acceleration curves, even though we see so many good initiatives and so many good signs of real change, real action, still on the global level, these curves are going in the wrong direction. So what will it take for us to not sit here in 20 years again and see the same patterns? How can we turn this around? This is what I want to discuss for the next panel here. So I will call them up one by one. And now I have my glasses, so I hope I can see. All right, so the first one has a really interesting job. He's the head of delegation to UNFCCC at the Swedish Ministry of Climate and Enterprise. He's the Sweden's chief negotiator during the COP meetings. Please, Mattias Frömeri, come up on stage and give him a big hand.
Here?
Yeah, that's good, that's good. See if we have some place for you here among my papers. All right. Are you already working with COP28?
Yes, indeed.
Yes, of course. It will happen in November, December, right?
Yes.
In Dubai. Yeah. So, a lot of science here. Please, I give you some opportunity to reflect a few minutes on what you've heard so far.
Thanks so much. And first of all, thanks for allowing me this opportunity to listen. I mean, I think it's, someone said it's sobering, and indeed it is sobering, all these science which you've been putting together. And yet again, a call for us sort of more on the policy side to be working even harder to make sure that we meet those kind of targets which we've all set and are also being more sort of evident as we move along. And I think 6 brief points from my side. I mean, the first one would be the sobering one. Secondly, on the targets, I mean, I think it's just to give you an idea of where we are within the negotiations. When we try to bring forward these kind of new, what could be perceived as targets, or sort of breaking down targets that we've already set, there is quite a strong opposition to that from, let me say, developing countries at large. I mean, not pointing to specific countries, and maybe some developed countries as well, saying that we've set our targets in the Paris Agreement, and there's no need for further targets. So just to sort of to give you an idea of the potential difficulties of actually agreeing new targets to at least within the climate sphere. My third point would be, I think that our colleague is presenting on the water issue, sort of had this slide on supply and demand transformation. I think that's a really good example of sort of how we can provide concrete measures which might not be perceived as targets, but at least sort of providing input to the work that we're doing. And I mean, we're working on water when it comes to climate adaptation, of course, but I think the same kind of approach could be taken when it comes to the energy transition, for example. You know, what kind of supply and demand measures would need to be put in place to accelerate the energy transition. My fourth point, I mean, maybe stating the obvious, but I think much of what you have presented provides us also with input in terms of how we strengthen the interlinkages between health, climate, biodiversity, and so forth. I mean, personally, I believe that we're not good enough at that. I mean, it's easy sort of to say at an overarching level that we need to have an integrated approach, but when it comes to the policy design, it's much more difficult. So I think here again, the kind of examples that we can get from science, from other practitioners, even better for us both at sort of at the global level, but even maybe more importantly at the national level, on how countries can actually integrate these kind of perspectives in their own policy making and into legislation. Fifth point, again, I think many of you probably are already engaged in these kind of circumstances, but as you know, we have within the UNFCCC we have this constituency systems of non-state actors contributing to the process. And when it comes to research, this is sort of grouped together in the Ringo constituency. I'm not sure to what extent you've heard about this, but there is one, at least.
More acronyms.
More acronyms, yeah.
What is it?
So the Ringo is, is research and then international governmental organization, something in that. I'm not actually quite sure, but Ringo. So that's sort of just to highlight that there is a formal input procedure into the UNFCCC where this kind of research could be useful. And we have a number of ongoing processes where I think that the kind of research which you've come up with sort of could be fed into that, on mitigation, on adaptation, on just transition. I mean, we have now for COP28, for example, we have the global stocktake, which is a key element of the Paris Agreement. Every 5 years we do a stocktake on where we are and more importantly on where we're going. So I think sort of feeding into that process. And my final point, just briefly, is on the just element. I think that's something which, of course, we've been hearing for a number of years on sort of, and there are different words to this. There's just transition, there's equity, there's carbon budget, I guess, in a way you could say as well. So here again, I think what I've heard, at least, the kind of examples that you've been providing gives us more sort of concrete examples on how to implement that kind of just transition, which so many of us are talking about. So those, again, provides also an input to us in terms of how we can be taking our work forward. So thanks so much.
Thank you. I just have to ask, please, a round of applause. I mean, we're talking now about sort of all the interlinkages between these different issues. And of course, I mean, the biodiversity COPs. How much do you collaborate with the negotiators for the biodiversity COPs in your work?
It's increasing. I mean, it could be more, but it's at least, just to give one brief example, we have we're doing one submission into the biodiversity COP on the linkages between biodiversity and climate. So that's that's ongoing now. So sort of trying to bring those two tracks together.
Okay, thanks. We have a huge panel coming up, so we'll have to move forward. So the next panelist is working hard to make Copenhagen carbon neutral already 2025. He's the Chief Advisor on Climate and Economy for the City of Copenhagen, and he's on the steering committee of the Global Green Growth Forum. Please, Morten Høyer. Big round of applause.
Where do you want me? Should we?
Yes.
Why don't you go?
So, thanks. It's the issue with Will Steffen. We would like to treat it kindly. Morten, please, an initial reflection. You've heard a lot about the science today. How are you turning all this science into real impact in a city context?
Yes, so 3 comments. First, of course, a big congratulations for this very impressive work. I've not had the chance to read your paper yet, but from the presentation, I think it's not only very important. I think we've heard presentations today showing that it is very important. But I also think it's important, I mean, in its own right. It's also important because you as an organization is, as I understand it, taking the next step towards application. So you're going into the area where you're trying to link the supply side of knowledge with the demand side of knowledge. And this is an entirely new area, so to speak. You're sort of moving from not just pushing the Earth's boundaries, to investigate Earth's boundaries, but also to push the boundaries of action. And of course, this is related to human behavior, which is an entirely different thing, because the Earth's boundaries are kind of naturally given, whereas the boundaries of action are made by ourselves. That's a very, very deep and interesting problem that I hope that you will be working on in the future. And of course, as invited to this event as a potential user of this, I think it is very interesting and very important. So in that sense, thank you for the invitation.
Thank you, Morten.
I have a comment more. Yeah, like in full disclosure, I think I'm not only from the city of Copenhagen. I'm also trained as an economist, and I'm also a concerned citizen. And from Monday to Thursday, I'm very happy with that state of affairs, particularly in a city like Copenhagen. But from Friday to Sunday, I'm full of doubt. And I think there are divergences here where I think the Earth system boundaries is missing something, and I think it's missing economics. And I think it reflects on what was said earlier today from Åsa and from Anna, that we need economics in this, because using the IPCC process as an example, it's not that long ago that it was publicly accepted that climate change is induced by humans. It was only I think in the 1990s or something like that, and 10 years later in the US. And once the general public accepted that this is humanly induced, comes in the question, so what does it cost to get there? And then moves in economics big time. And until that time, it was only the American-based work of Bill Nordhaus and others, important in its own right, with an important prize from this institution. But I think the same is going to happen here, because now we've got the scientific base on this, so the question is going to be, what's it going to cost? And I think you need to engage big time in what I would call the right economics, which means to ask the questions, what does it cost, but also what are the benefits? What's the cost of inaction? And you are used as scientists of working with nonlinearities, thresholds and tipping points, with which economists in their models usually don't have. So when they evaluate policies, when they assess projections of how is employment, exports and imports, etc., going to go, usually they don't engage in these kinds of things. It will be very interesting to see you engage and perhaps teach my economics colleagues how could this be done. Engage more in that, and I think interesting stuff could emerge.
Yeah, and we are in the house of the Bayer Institute of Ecological Economics, where they've tried really to get that collaboration happening. So, exactly, really interesting point. And I think that the transformation pathways of the Earth Commission will deal with economics as well. We'll ask the commissioners later on. So thanks, Morten. We'll move on. Okay, so the next panelist is a lawyer and a specialist in indigenous peoples, land rights, environment, and natural resources management. She's the executive director of the Tenure Facility, Nonette Royo. Please, big hand. Come and join me. There was a lot of sort of thoughts on justice, access to resources, etc. I guess that is right up your alley. What's your reactions so far?
Yeah, deep gratitude. Yeah, I'm speaking from my heart as an Indigenous person and as the CEO, the executive director of the Tenure Facility. We're based here in Stockholm. Finally, our proactive data and our scientists are taking a stand and saying, these are the metrics, these are the boundaries for safety, for justice, for people and planet. Indigenous peoples and local communities have been saying this, and that's why the Tenjo facility is dedicated. It's CEDA started us, and now we're scaled, to the ambition to recognize land rights of the forest guardians, indigenous peoples and local communities in tropical rainforests in the Amazon basin, in the Congo basin, and in tropical Asia. So it is a space now to begin to really act and work together. So I'm very thrilled and would be very happy to establish conversations, especially with the scientists who are here. Wonderful.
Thanks. So if you were to give sort of one big advice to the scientists continuing now on the sort of justice part, what would that be? What is that they really need to keep?
I can speak from the nature side, because that's where our highest exposure is, and to have nature ecosystems and working landscapes with metrics is really amazing, and to know that we breached those, but to know that we're working with the people who are 400. Our data is 470 million of them occupy 2/3 of the world's terrestrial landscapes, and 80% of our biodiversity are in these places, and it overlaps 40% with protected areas. So it is a lot to work with and to explore. So I really think that this is where the space is, right? So, yeah.
Thanks a lot. Thanks. All right, so more panelists now. Are you ready for more panelists? Good, good, good. The technical director of the Science Based Targets Network, she has a PhD from Duke University, and Varsha Vijay, please, welcome up. So I saw the launch of the Science-Based Targets for Nature the other day, and I guess there are many things and links between the Earth Commission and what you're doing. Please, what's your reaction so far?
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. First, thank you to all of you, and thank you for making space to discuss this important work and to think about the connections through to implementation and the sort of change we know is urgent and necessary. So first, a huge congratulations to my colleagues at the Earth Commission, both those who are here and those who are everywhere and contributing to this work. This is really an important scientific achievement in defining the Earth system boundaries for a safe and just future, so really centering nature and people. The Science Based Targets Network, part of the Global Commons Alliance that you heard Jane speak to, is a collaboration of more than 80 nonprofits and mission-driven organizations equipping companies and cities with measurable, actionable, and time-bound science-based targets for nature. Our work has started with companies, as you already alluded to, and the ambition of the first release of our work does align with this new Earth system boundary science in some key ways. First, I think it's important to emphasize the principles that we're aligning on. So first, centering nature and people. That's really at the core of the work we do. And I think another important note as a scientist is both organizations are not shying away from complexity. This is a really complex problem. The solutions are also complex. And we're not only saying and talking about this complexity in all the varied ways to think about Earth system boundaries, but we're also keeping it in a systemic perspective. So really recognizing the inexorable connections between climate and nature and people and nature, and keeping that at the heart of what we're doing. To think about kind of real concrete connections, in our methodology, another kind of key place is in the underlying quantification of the level of ambition of spatially explicit or location-specific targets, which is what science-based targets for nature are. That's most clearly seen within our freshwater target setting methodology for freshwater quantity and quality. So that's a kind of interesting place of connection there. The other place is in the kind of trajectory of actions that we're trying to enable and incentivize for companies to move towards being within these safe and just boundaries. These actions need to be taken in line with the mitigation hierarchy, so reducing negative impacts on the environment and society before focusing on those positive actions like restoration. That's something that I think can be seen already in our freshwater target setting methodologies as well as our land target setting methodologies, which focus on ecosystem preservation as well as restoration. So looking forward, I'm really excited about the coming collaborations with the Earth Commissions. So thinking about, just in a note of humility, acknowledging the gaps in both of our works, seeking to address those, particularly in the marine realm, which has already been acknowledged, but also really in centering the justice work. I think beyond just noting how important it is to bring justice in the conversation, I'm really excited about the fact that there are now quantifiable metrics attached to that justice component that we can bring in, as well as to think about how we're doing our work. So to ensure that companies are setting effective and equitable targets. And to do that, we'll have this challenging work of translation ahead of us, which is really a collaboration bringing together the applied sciences at the Science Based Targets Network, as well as this fantastic theoretical and scientific foundation from the Earth Commission. So thank you.
Thanks. Big hand. So this is something that is related, of course, to the science-based targets for climate. So is it like 3,000 companies or so who have set science-based targets for climate, right?
Yeah, I don't have the precise number, but it's something like that and growing.
And now it is like 17 companies or so who will road test this first version of the science-based target for nature.
Yeah.
And one Swedish company, right?
Yes, please don't quote me on that.
All right. Okay, so really exciting. And I know that many people are waiting for these science-based targets for nature because they have seen what the science-based targets for climate can do. So really looking forward to the coming sort of development of all this. Thanks. All right. So now it's time for a colleague of mine from the Stockholm Resilience Center. She's the Director of Education, and she has also founded the Pontus Schultz Foundation for more sustainable, diverse, and equal businesses. And she's the Program Director for our executive program in resilience thinking, where we gather a lot of leaders from the businesses. So you're like both scientists now and also a stakeholder because you know a lot about these companies that we work with. Lisa Schultz, big hand, please.
Thank you. Thanks all, and good to meet you all on stage here. And I can at least say something about what I've learned from my interactions with CEOs of large companies over the last 5 years, where we've brought together 16 leaders a year into a program on planetary boundaries and justice, and how we can actually bring the private sector towards a place where they're contributing to a positive future for people on the planet. And I think it's been fascinating to see this development now. What I hear from the reason why we started engaging with the private sector at the Stockholm Resilience Center, in addition to all of the work we are doing with local communities across the world and policymakers at different levels and so on, is twofold. One is, of course, that a lot of the transgressions we see is driven by the private sector. But also we see an increasing interest in the private sector in securing those systems that they all depend on, that we all depend on, the societies and the ecosystems. And in order to find a way to do that, they want to base their strategies on science. And so the CEOs need to be able to explain to their investors, to their employees, to their customers and suppliers, not to mention the regulators that they're also always speaking to, what needs to be done, why does it need to be done, and how can we do that? And then these Earth system boundaries helps them with that. We know from the planetary boundaries framework that it's been very helpful for them to move beyond the carbon dioxide, to get a more systemic picture of all of the pressures that we put on the planet. But we also know that although that gives an aggregate understanding of the pressures, it doesn't say anything about where do those pressures come from, who is causing them, where do they appear, who is impacted, and so on. And I think this justice aspect that we now add, and also the localization of, you know, where these impacts are and where the drivers come from, it will be very helpful for these leaders to be able to explain why this is so important, and also what needs to be done about it, what is their responsibility as an organization in a sector. The quantification of the metrics will be super helpful as well, and the translation done through the science-based targets network. So I'm really excited about that. I think that what will be challenging, and that remains, of course, that not really part of this work, is for them to find, again, you know, what is it, like the key message is, again, like we transgressed, it's beyond, you know, it's even worse than what we had thought. We need to do much more, but for them, what they need to understand is, you know, how can they act? Who can they collaborate with? You know, what is the most important thing for them to do? So there, I think we will need to continue that work. Yeah.
And what I've learned from sort of being with the CEOs is also that they don't really like to talk about minimizing negative impacts. They're much more interested in talking about how can you have a positive impact on something, right?
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think, but it is also very important for them to minimize, you know, significant harm. And it's really part of business. Like you're not allowed to harm while you're doing your business. But what this also can provide is sort of a framework for innovation. You know, how can you contribute positively to address some of these boundaries, or address people's needs within those boundaries and so on. And that's where some of the, you know, the greatest creativity can come. And of course, the private sector is full of people who have a lot of dedication, ambition, they're doers, they have resources, they have a lot of capacity. And when they have a very robust framework to sort of work within, a lot can happen. But then it's very important that that framework is based on the best available science. And one more thing, of course, is that then that also needs to be translated into regulations. But I think if we can sort of look at what has happened in the climate realm, you know, we can sort of show to these people that actually, you know, regulations will follow. You know, it takes a while, but they will follow when we're all on the same page. Yeah.
Thanks, Lisen. Big hand to Lisen. So, and after that, the last panelist was the Sustainability Director of the Year in Sweden 2020. He is the Chief Sustainability Officer at Max Burgers. Please, Kai Török. Big hand. So, Kai, you are actually really trying to turn science into impact. Please tell us, how do you do that, and what are your general reflections from listening to the scientists today?
First of all, thank you. Thank you very much. You're making my job much easier. My job is in one way to help this family-owned company to change business, transform. And that means I have to focus so much about the how. And you're just making it much easier to me because you're defining the what should change, what should be done. And I think in one way with Planetary Boundaries, you were kind of saying this is how you could run the planet. With the Lancet guide, you were saying this is how you can run the food and health. And now we're obviously in the corridor, as I heard, about the safe and just. So it makes my job so much easier because I believe the real power, how we drive change the most efficiently, is to not focus too much on the problems, but not on fighting the old, but on building the new. So you just give me much more freedom to do that because you're defining where we should go. So I think this can drive a lot of innovation. Because innovation, for innovators, we need to understand the problem really, really well. So for us, we understand that we're part of the problem. That's not kind of a surprise. We've said that since 2008. We have launched a number of plant-based and lacto-vegetarian burgers. We have increased sales of those with 900%. It has reduced the food impact of the food with 30% per 1,000 kilocalories. And that is a strategy that we have working with that. But now with all this, we can just relate our strategy to just society and all of that as well to refine what could we do more. So I think this could drive innovation in so many businesses, not just our own, but in so many others, because sustainability or the need for sustainability is really a driver of innovation globally all over. So then we change the focus, as you were into, from like where's the problem to where are the solutions, and this just helps us go there. And I also think this could be interesting, that it could increase the sense of urgency around all of these matters, because we talked about the planet, and some people don't hear people when they're here at the planet. But now we're bringing people in more with justice, and we have a lot of justice fighters all over the world. So I think also it could maybe change the narrative a little bit, that this has just gotten even more important.
Thank you, Kai. Big hand for Kai. And I know you were probably the first in the world to have the carbon footprints up on the menu for the different dishes. Will you now have nutrient footprints and water footprints on the menu as well, after listening to the scientists today?
Yeah, I mean, we've been thinking about nutrient footprint for a while. There are some legislative actions that we need to find the right way to do that. So it's really credible and in line with science. I think, I mean, imagining a guest at a burger chain coming in, maybe it's a soccer mom with 2 kids, 9 and 7, and they just want to order, and they're looking at the menu, and so how can they get the right information at the right time that changes the behavior? I think it's like a 3-second window I have to work with. Yeah. So I'm going to have to work a lot with emotions here, because the emotions drive our decisions. Facts are really good, but emotions are strong. So how can we do that? How can we connect this to emotions?
Thanks, Kai. Thanks, Kai. I'm thinking about you, Morten. We were talking about earlier on that you, in your climate targets for Copenhagen, try to include also consumption of different things. So how do you work with companies to make sure that more companies try to do what Kai and his company are doing?
Well, mostly on the innovation side, actually, because right now Copenhagen has ambitious targets on climate, but they're related to its own territorial emissions. So now we're working very hard to make new plans towards 2030, 2035, which is related to consumption-based emissions, and that's really, really hard. And that's exactly the kind of work here that we've been engaged with. We've actually passed also the first edition of a donut for Copenhagen, which is going to be discussed by the city council next week.
Okay, thanks.
But with companies, mostly on the innovative side, which is very interesting.
And I think that's really good, because when some companies are starting to change, the others see it. So sometimes it's just good to go with the leaders, and sometimes it's good to go with the big ones. It's different strategies, but leaders can often change faster.
And Varsha, I mean, the science-based targets for nature are working both with companies and cities. So what do you have to say to Morten and Kai about how to use them now?
Well, I think first that we have a lot to learn. So our methodology for companies is much more developed. So we've just done our first release for companies, but we're still bringing up our work on cities. So kind of inherent in the work we're doing is understanding what levers are available to certain actors. So in trying to figure out what the best science-based targets for cities are, it may not be the same metric or indicators as we need for companies, because it has to be responsive to those actions. So there's a lot of learning first to understand what has been done, what works, what are the different approaches to bring the kind of quantification elements into a methodology specific to that actor.
Nonette, anything you want to add here from an indigenous and local perspective when talking about two cities and companies? What do you think they need to?
We're in a corridor where there are working landscapes and natural ecosystems, and both are occupied by peoples, right? And what's important is that, I think, in fact, to emphasize this, indigenous peoples have location. So they're on site. They are much more able to navigate monitoring. And second, they have relationships. So not just within themselves, but with nature. We are very much interconnected and dependent, and therefore kinships are very important. And then there is the level of value. So the value is stewardship. The value is intergenerational survival. So you only take what you can, you don't take too much. So this is why we're working with them. And then what's important is when I helped, I was the one I was hosting a session at the COP26 when there was a clear commitment by the governments to recognize land rights for forest guardians. So it is important that this collective, stewarding is secure. And that's where, to answer your question, the places where we can have conversations are in places where land stewardship, land tenure is secure with companies. Otherwise, they would say, it's risky, it's conflict, right? So this is so important. And now we're advancing 8.3 million hectares since we started here in Sweden are now secure, right? In the 26 countries where we're operating. And the way we invest is serious, $1 million a year, committing up to 5 years or 10 years. So we have right now 24 million this year, and next year it will be 34 million that we will commit. And where are we getting this funding? From the commitments, right? From the pledges. And we give 80% of it down directly to indigenous peoples. So it is less risky in these places for other sectors to come in and look, right? And so where's that conversation going? So I think this is the challenge now. It's action. And it's action with the change agents. I was very happy that you were saying it, Jane. It is the change agents with clear rights, and that's where space is. Yeah.
And Matthias, is this something you see in your work as well, that the issues that Nonette is talking about right now is taking more place in the climate negotiations?
The easy answer is yes and no, because I think also what we're seeing increasingly as we're progressing on climate action, that these potential conflicts between, on the one hand, I think quite clearly, climate and biodiversity will become more apparent. And it will be upon us as policymakers, but also on practitioners to find ways forward to sort of consolidating those sometimes conflicting goals. Just to take the obvious example, if you're constructing wind parks, you need a lot of land. And how do you sort of reconcile that with land rights then? We have to progress on how to reconcile those to potential conflicting interests, which will become more apparent as we need more electricity, and we need to supply more electricity to people who don't have electricity today. And the same goes for solar parks. So I think that's something where we need to be having this kind of conversation even more intensely, both on a global scale, but even more, maybe more importantly, on the national level.
Listen, what do you think the next sort of round of CEOs that will come to the education you have? What will you say to them about the Earth system boundaries? Will that make their sort of next board meeting more complex, or will it help them?
Well, I think clarification is always good, like an advancement of knowledge and understanding, and I think it's about how we explain the interactions between those boundaries, what they actually are and what they can help you with. But I think a key message that has emerged, stronger and stronger is that for carbon dioxide, you can have sort of a global measurement, and it doesn't matter where in the world you're sort of emitting it. You can do the compensation or investments in nature-based solutions and so on. Again, you need to know the place. What is happening there? How can you work on that in a way that is supportive towards the people living there and the other organisms? So I think that those two aspects, the justice and the connection to people and the connection to place, will be difficult for them, but also helpful, because it's been a bit fuzzy to many of them how they can translate planetary boundaries into targets and actions and so on. Yeah. And that work is now, more and more rigorous. But it's also a learning journey where we all need to work together. Like we cannot come with those final answers as scientists on how that should be done for everyone. Yeah.
Probably there will be some help now from the Science Based Targets for Nature
Yes.
with materiality analysis along complex value chains and include many of these aspects going beyond climate and also include other things.
And then, sorry, I just have to also say again, this Target Olympics, I think it was Åsa Persson who said it, that also many of these companies are now sort of beyond, like, okay, we've set the targets, but now it's really, what are we doing? What is prioritized? What helps? What is cost efficient to do and so on. That's where we need so much more work also, because you can always try and sharpen targets, but it's really what you're doing that matters. The planet doesn't care about our targets if they're just papers.
All right, we're having too much fun and we're lagging behind in the program, so I will just give you sort of a last take-home message, a chance to come with a last take-home message on what you have learned today from listening to the Earth System Boundaries, or some kind of key insights that you want people to keep in mind when they leave this room. Who wants to start? Matthias, yes.
I think I'll go for the same kind of messages that we use on the global conversation. That's urgency and opportunity. The urgency based on science, which we have obviously here again today, but also the opportunities. And I think many of the solutions which have been put forward here point to the opportunities. But what also when we speak about the opportunities is very much what business brings and the kind of business solutions which are out there. Like the IPCC says, there are solutions in every sector to limit warming to 1.5 within this decade. So let's make best use of those by bringing all this work together.
Thanks. Morten.
Well, I think it's important to recognize that I think most of the people in this room, we are already convinced we have a problem and we need to act. But I think there are a lot of people out there that don't yet understand and accept the premise. So I think it's very important to communicate to everyone why this is important and why action is important.
Thanks. Annette?
3 Ts: timeline, trust, and transparency. Timeline, you just said, we are given 10 years by IPCC. It's important to act. So where the standing forests are, where nature is still intact, let's keep it and restore it. And then trust is so important. We work together, we find solutions and really act and stop talking too much. And the third is, the metrics is very important for transparency.
Thanks. Varsha, please.
I guess that the hard work begins now. We have these quantifications from the Earth Commission. We have the methodologies from the Science Based Targets Network, but it's about embedding in place, embedding in rights and knowledge, as well as kind of ensuring that these aren't empty targets and empty science, but that we actually have the transformative change we need.
Thanks. Lisa.
And I'm thinking about framed creativity, that, ideally, if we share a frame, then we can unleash that enormous creativity that we have as a species and the collaborative capacity as well. And, believing in that we actually all want to secure future generations, and even, the fly that has been, representing the biosphere in this room, and their siblings. I think, but we need that shared frame of what the challenge is and how we can address it. And then within that, hopefully we can be creative together.
Thanks, Lisa. I'm really glad we had a living part of the biosphere as well, not only the dead coral that I brought. So.
And no one has killed it. That's also great.
Fly on the wall, right? Yeah. Kai.
Yeah. If I ask you to tell a story, any story, maybe nothing comes up. But if I tell you that it has to include a Norwegian mother, 400 kilos of potatoes, and a broken down car, you will have a lot of ideas. And I think what we learned here is that there's so many limitations to sustainability. We saw a new one here, and limitations is really the mother of creativity. So I see enormous amount of potential innovation coming out of this. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Big hand. Thanks all, and I really, really hope that we can turn all this beautiful science into some real impact, so we don't stand here 20 years in the future and see all these curves going in the wrong direction again. We owe Will Steffen that, I think. Thanks to all, and a big hand again to the panel. Good job. Thanks.
Thank you.
All right. It's been a long afternoon. Maya, come and help me. What's happening? What are we doing now?
What are we doing now? We actually do have a little bit of time for a Q&A. We can probably do 5 minutes. So if there is anything that anybody is burning to ask, and we can refer to, any of the speakers today, then please put your hand up and one of the team can come over.
And I mean, there's been so many interesting presentations and discussions going on. So we apologize for not having more time for questions right now, but there will be a mingle afterwards. So approach people there if you don't want to approach them now with a question. But if there are a couple of questions, please, anyone.
Hey, hello.
Hi, my question is directed to Kai. I wanted to know, and also to the other people who address the problems with agriculture and meat consumption, and I wanted to know why so far we've talked so much about the consumption of meat, and you also brought up the example of the woman coming to choose which burger they would choose, and I would like to know why we're focusing on the woman rather than the supplier of the meat. So instead of regulating consumption, we should also regulate the production. Yeah.
And you changed your name from Max Hamburgers to Max Burgers, right?
Yeah, we changed that because we realized that we can sell so many good things between two parties that doesn't have to have a high impact. But I mean, the regulation part is what politicians do, I think. And what we can do as a company is to ask ourselves, can we create a better business? Can we use our, the habit we have of trying to solve problems in a good way? So we can, of course, sometimes say we can't use those suppliers. They are not good enough. But we're also in the business of trying to make a living. So how can we at least explore if we can do it in a better way? I think that's the main responsibility of any company. And if you want to go further, you're pushing for it as well. But you at least have to ask that question. So it's if politicians regulated more, we would have to do less. I think that that's also connected.
Turn off the mic. I've seen that. David, you had a question? Yeah?
Thanks. Yes, no, I'd like to respond to your question as well. So it's come up in the Global Biodiversity Framework, and one of the targets was pointing the finger at individual consumers to make better choices. But it's really about the system that they have to work in. So the production systems have to give them the right choices. And I think that's a classic technique used in industry to push the responsibility onto somebody else. And so really seeing that we have to shift the system. The transformations have to provide better options for people to live better lives, more sustainable lives. So pushing in that direction is certainly a part of the messaging and the analysis we'd like to move forward as well.
Thanks. Any more? There's so many brilliant people in the room. I guess you have questions.
A point I would like to make is that we are at a pretty unique place in human development, where so many different things are gelling. So the concern of the environment, the use of social media, a greater consciousness of youth, and a better sense of the direction that we're going. So just as David has mentioned, in one area something is happening. Under the ISO standards, we just reviewed ISO 14015 on environmental due diligence. So you have the standards approach, you have the global framework, you have IPCC, you have IBES. They're all sort of working, circling around this dead carcass of an earth we have. And sooner or later, they will resurrect it. So from a position of extreme negativity, I'm saying there's hope, and this is the time. Thank you.
Thanks for that. That's worth a big hand, I guess. You painted an image there was really depressing first, but you saved it. Thanks. Yes.
Two questions over here. Sorry, Naki. I squeezed past. Thank you. If you could just say your name as well.
Okay. Hi, Pernilla Bergmark Eriksson and Exponential Roadmap Initiative. So I have a question. With climate, I think it made all the difference when starting to discuss halving emissions every decade from talking about temperature, at least if you're a company, because what does it mean, that a temperature level? So that is a question. For all the other boundaries, could we find similar ways of having simple rule of thumbs which are expressed in an actionable way? I think that will make all of a difference.
That's a good one. I think we will save that one for Johan later on when you come down and close this, right, Johan? I will ask the question again and repeat it for you. Let's take another question. Yes.
One more, Ingmar.
Thank you, Ingmar, and so we don't have time here. Great day and great report. Looking forward to see how this will be shared across media and internet. One question I have, though, is that, I mean, we have many problems. Now we have more problems. And justice, I think everyone in this room thinks that justice is important. I'm in the communication field, and I try to get people on board in the environment and climate agenda. And I mean, not everyone out there, policymakers, are positive about the word justice. Do we really need to talk about justice? Isn't it enough with the planetary boundary? And if the justice is lower than the planetary boundary, shouldn't we just lower and have the same goal, like it's the same for justice and planetary? I think it's a challenge to communicate this justice and get the people on board that are more conservative and don't see the word to be a just. They don't like that word. And we need them on board.
Okay, thanks. I think both these questions we will actually leave to Jovita and Johan, right? So how do we... Because they are going to wrap up, and I think how do we make these sort of Earth system boundaries more actionable for companies in different ways? And do we really need a justice boundary or not? So we'll leave it to them, right? Because they're going to wrap up now.
They are going to wrap up.
Yeah.
Both come to the stage, please. That would be fantastic.
Johan and Jovita, please give them a big hand, and hope you can answer all questions now.
Thank you very much. It's been a fascinating afternoon. Let's take justice first, because that's the more difficult question, I think. 30 years ago, when I started working on my PhD thesis on climate change in developing countries, I was writing a lot about justice in it, and my supervisor said, take out the word justice, use equity, maybe make it, just focus on the empirics, talk about north-south issues, don't make it so normative. And I think that we've come a long way now that we can at least talk about justice openly in a science paper and get it published in Nature and have also the editor-in-chief of Nature talk about it. So we've come a long way with justice and bringing it onto the storyline. I think people are much more willing to talk about injustices, and there is a general degree of consensus that if you see somebody dying from something or you see somebody displaced, that you can see an injustice. And so somehow creating that emotional link which you were talking about, how do we communicate this emotionally? I think it's really important to create a bond with people and to show that these injustices are not just happening somewhere far away in Bangladesh or in the Maldives, but can also happen right here because of the impacts of climate change on people here. So I think somehow we have to make that connection between injustices globally and the injustices that might happen here because of climate change or biodiversity loss or whatever. And we have to make that emotional connection. That's the next step in the story. But I think it's really important to bring the justice issue in, because if we evade the justice issue, we will keep postponing this discussion ad infinitum into the future. And we've already noted that without taking justice into account, it's impossible to live in a safe planet, because you can't force the rest of the world not to use their fossil fuels. So just to give you an example, more than 80% of the fossil fuels that remain are in the developing world. And if we try to force them not to use it without taking some degree of justice into our narrative, it's not going to happen. So we do need to bring justice on board. On talking about making things actionable, I think we need to look at action at all levels. Our current story focuses on cities and industries, but and that's clearly true, that industry will focus much more on how to change consumer behavior, but governments need to also focus on how to change industry behavior and maybe leveling the playing field for industry in some ways so that there is some degree of option for industry to move forward. But very concretely, a target like 25% more nature in every square kilometer is something that we can all relate to. We can all think about, how can I have 25% more nature in my own compound, in my own house, in my own neighborhood? You know, so these are things that can be done. The other target for biosphere is more difficult for us to do at an individual level, but there are things. The groundwater target is something that is quite close to us for farmers. So how can we organize that in the food industry or in the farming industry? So I think there are ways to translate that into everyday approaches for people. But I just want to come back and say, I hope that through adopting the justice approach, we don't put people off. We bring them on board.
Maybe we should use another word, because justice is very leftist word. So maybe we should find another way.
I think.
I agree with you.
Yeah.
It's the communication of it. That's the challenge.
So we have to find a way to go into the hearts and the emotions of the Republicans. All right.
Yes, so, well, a few comments on this really important reflection on justice, and perhaps just first a little reminder, and don't take this as a kind of trying to escape or a defense speech, but what we've tried to do with the Earth Commission is not to provide the world with scalable solutions that are implementable across Republicans or businesses or cities. We're providing the scientific assessment, and then there are a number of steps, and Shumei really showed them very clearly, before it is actually implementable in Stockholm or in New Delhi or with Unilever or in Washington at the administration. So it's a question here of recognizing that we're trying to stay true to, let's say, an IPCC type philosophy, that we're trying to provide the state of knowledge and deliver that in ways that can then be picked up by other stakeholders to work towards a translation, operationalization. So that's, I think it's really important, because otherwise we'll be accused of opinionating the whole agenda. We're really trying to be objective in that assessment. Then my view on justice, and Joyit and I have had many discussions on this, is that I come back to the point I made earlier, that I find it very assuring that the social science assessment, through the very, very rich framework that we've applied with the intergenerational, the intergenerational, the interspecies justice definition on significant harm, lands at having equal assessment on safety and justice for many of the boundaries. So you can run with them directly. You don't even have to use the word justice, actually, because they're actually the same scientific assessment. And so Joyit and I hold hands and we land at the same conclusion. And that I think, and it's a 3-year journey we've done, and we do not agree with each other on all these issues. So I think it's quite remarkable, actually, that we've come to this point. You don't want to hear our debates that we've had during this journey, which has been an enormous learning journey for both sides. So that is something to bring with us. But I'm actually on your side in the sense that we also, I mean, this is beyond the Earth Commission, to actually be quite pragmatic and quite practical. I wanted to share with you, for example, that apart from the Science-Based Target Network and Vasha, what you shared with us here, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, for example, the world's largest network of multinational companies, are standing there demanding science-based targets beyond climate. It's an enormous they're ready for it. They're kind of wondering, where are you with the Earth Commission? Why can't you deliver these numbers? We want them. We want to go beyond carbon. We recognize that across the value chain, we need to take responsibility for water, for nitrogen, for phosphorus, for land, for biodiversity. So there is a demand out there, and they are definitely not ready for justice. They want to have numbers that they can trust from, let's say, like the climate science equivalent. And we have to teach them. I think we have to really go into a discussion on what does it mean to also, why is it valuable for a company to also bring in justice? Because it gives you a larger chance of having stable conditions in the economies where your markets are. Because you don't want to have significant harm pulling the rug under the feet of all your customers, which is actually what justice does if you do not take it seriously. But I think that that's something that we still have to work on. And that, absolutely.
And at Davos, at the World Economic Forum, we were really surprised that people were so interested in knowing, and these are business people we're talking about, who wanted to know about the safe and just boundaries. And the feedback we got at Davos was that people found it very interesting to understand the relationship between social and the economic aspects. So there are people who are open-minded and are listening, and those are the people we're trying to communicate to.
So then, yeah, they exist, believe it or not, the open-minded business leaders out there. So, and then just a final point on this about being actionable. Well, I think it's easy to forget in the frustration that things are moving too slow, what amazing progress we've made in the climate domain, that here comes 30 years of, and 6 IPCC assessments, landing at a science-based boundary on 1.5 degrees Celsius, translated to a carbon budget, translated to carbon law, giving us some mitigation pathways, that ends up in the Green Deal and the Fit for 55. You have over 60 countries in the world with net zero pathways. You have over 1,000 companies, 2,000 companies in the SBTI, if I recall right. 3,000 even, Patrick? Yeah. I mean, this is what we need to do on the other Earth system boundaries as well. And of course, it is a challenge to get those actionable steps taken. But I think that what we've tried to do with the Earth Commission is really identify indicators, particularly on the biosphere integrity. I think Peter gave a fantastic presentation here, showing how these can be actionable. 20% of each square kilometer of managed nature needs to be kept with its ecological functions at semi-natural state. I mean, that's very workable with. It's very different to our extinction rate quantification in the original planetary boundaries, for example. So I think we've come a big step forward to provide humanity with science that can be translated into workable targets for humanity's future. And I think this seminar, to me, I don't know what we're doing here, Fred, by the way. Is it a Q&A or are we closing? But anyway, but if we're closing, I want to thank you. I really want to thank you all for your patience in listening to this very complex piece of work that we've been struggling with. And we're so proud of coming to this point. And we really hope that this is a starting point for a journey where we can really become stewards for people and planet in a fully integrated manner to the future. And just a final remark on the fact that the Earth Commission is unique in the sense that it's been a very constructive stress factor on us scientists to be part of the Global Commons Alliance. That we've had always, peeking around the corner, the Science Based Target Network, the Earth HQ, all these business leaders and philanthropists saying, we want the numbers, we want to act, we want you on the ground. It's been tremendously difficult for us, but I think it's been very healthy. We've been forced all the time to think about what next, and you've helped us there today. Thank you.
Thank you, Johan. Thank you, Rita, for leading this commission and leading the day, starting and ending the day. But you're not ending yet. We will also have, give a big hand for Wendy Broadgate, who is the director of the Future Earth Hub here in Stockholm. You can go with mine.
Thank you. And I will advance the slide. Yes, thank you everyone. It's been such an exciting day. And I'm delighted that there's so many people still here at the end of the day. So thank you for your interest. I'd like to say a few thank yous. First, thank you, Johan, Joyita, and Professor Kindaher, who isn't here today, for your leadership. As you indicated, Johan, this has not been an easy journey, but it's been a super exciting, challenging journey. And now, the paper is published. So let's celebrate. Thank you to all of the speakers and panelists today. But thank you to the huge team behind the Earth Commission. As been mentioned today, there's more than 50 authors on this paper. That includes experts from around the world, but also a number of behind-the-scenes experts, more junior scientists. And many of you are here. Please wave your hands. Everyone who's been involved in this Nature paper today. We've got many in the room. Great. And I have to give a huge shout out to our corresponding author, Steve Lade, here. Steve has done the most fantastic job, meticulously coordinating all of the inputs in the multiple edits to this paper. So thank you, Steve, for really, really fantastic work. So again, thank you all for joining us. As many people have said, this journey is collaborative within science, and collaborative with end users, society on action. So really, let's collaborate. I'd like to also thank our funders. There are many funders behind this effort who've also collaborated together to help support this. And last but not least, I would like to thank the team who have organized this symposium, particularly Lisa Jacobson, very much behind the scenes, masterminding this, Cecilia, Maya, and the full team, and Fredrik also for your role in moderating and making this happen. So as I said, the paper is now published. Let's celebrate. There is a mingle in the foyer for the next hour. But also we wanted to take the opportunity to take a photo of the authors, those who are behind this paper, on the front steps. So the rest of you get first in the queue for the mingle. But if all of the authors can go to the front steps for a photo immediately. Thank you.